The church was cold. Not the kind of cold that slips in through a cracked window or a broken furnace. It was the deep, settled cold of stone walls that have been absorbing English winters for 400 years and have decided, quietly and without apology, that cold is simply what they are now. Clara Whitmore stood at the entrance of St. Giles Church in the village of Fen Hollow, her bouquet gripped in both hands, and listened to the organ play a hymn she had heard at every funeral she had ever attended. She found it interesting that someone had chosen it for a wedding. She was 31 years old. Her hair was the color of old oak wood, brown and unremarkable, and it had taken her an hour to pin it into a shape that would survive the day. Her dress was white, as the occasion required, and it fit her correctly, which was the best she expected of it. She was not a woman who inspired poetry. She had known this for most of her life and had settled into the knowledge the way a person settles into a house they did not choose, by learning which floorboards creaked, which windows let in the draft, and which rooms were better left with the door closed. Her father stood beside her. He smelled of pipe tobacco and old wool, and his hand on her arm was steady and warm and communicated nothing except steadiness, which was what she needed most, and what he had always been able to provide. At the far end of the aisle, standing in front of the altar, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his gaze directed at the precise correct point in the middle distance, was Edmund Ashford, the 7th Duke of Hartwell. He was 40 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that powerful men cultivate over decades, until they forget they cultivated it. He was not watching her walk in. He was watching the altar. That was appropriate. The altar was where the event would take place, and there was nothing wrong with a man looking at the place where things were about to happen. She counted the candles on the left side of the nave. 14. She shifted her attention to the right. 14 there as well. Someone had been careful about symmetry. She appreciated that. Symmetry required counting, and counting required attention, and attention was a form of care. The guests filled 3/4 of the pews. Edmund's side held old names in dark coats, cousins and business associates, and a man near the front who had the precisely upright posture of a solicitor, professionally alert even at a Saturday morning ceremony. Her own side held her parents' neighbors from Dorset, and in the 3rd row her sister Nell, with her husband Geoffrey and their son Oliver, 7 months old and sleeping against Geoffrey's shoulder, with the absolute confidence of someone who has decided the occasion does not concern him. Her father tightened his hand on her arm. Ready? She was not entirely certain what ready meant here. The dress was on, the venue was filled, the groom was in position. All components were present and correctly arranged. Yes, she said, because what else do you say? They walked. Her new shoes made a small, precise click on the stone floor with every step, the sound of something being marked off. She focused on it for the first few paces, because focusing on her own footsteps was more useful than focusing on anything else. She watched Edmund turn when he heard her coming. He looked at her with the expression of a man confirming that what he ordered has arrived correctly. He was not unkind about it. It was simply the look of someone for whom decisions, once made, are verified rather than celebrated. He held out his hand. She placed hers in it. His grip was dry and steady, and exactly as firm as the occasion required. The vicar began. She held her bouquet and let the familiar words move past her. Commitment and faithfulness, and through difficulty and ease, and until the end of days. And while they moved, she let her attention rest on the crack in the 3rd pew on the right, a diagonal line running from the top edge toward the center of the wood, filled with something that had dried to a slightly lighter shade than the surrounding timber. Old work. Someone had noticed the crack and filled it, and not bothered to match the color, which meant they cared enough to fix it, and not enough to fix it perfectly, which was a specific kind of person, and she found herself wondering about that person in the middle of her own wedding ceremony, and decided this was probably fine. Edmund delivered his vows with the calm efficiency of a man who had prepared them and saw no reason to ornament them beyond their content. He held her hand throughout. He returned the small pressure at the correct moment. Everything he did was exactly on cue, and she had noticed this quality in him before the marriage and was noticing it again now. When it was her turn, she said her words clearly and in order. Her voice did not shake. She had not expected it to shake. The ring was placed. The register was signed in the vestry, her handwriting clear and even on the page, his large and deliberate. And then it was done in the way that things are done when they have been properly arranged, which is to say completely and without loose ends. On the church steps in the cold November afternoon, with the photographer calling instructions the wind kept lifting away, Edmund stood beside her and looked past her at the camera and squeezed her hand once, briefly, in what she read as acknowledgement. "You look very well," he said. "Thank you," she said. Those were most of the words they said to each other that day. The wedding breakfast at Hartwell House lasted 3 hours. The food was exceptional. Edmund had brought a cook from London for the occasion, a Mrs. Pritchard who moved through the kitchen with the intense, focused energy of someone fighting a very important small war, and the result was a meal that made 3 separate guests approach Clara in low, impressed tones to ask where she had found her. Clara gave them the honest answer, which was that she had not found her at all. Edmund had handled that. The wine was better than the food, which was saying something considerable, and by 7 in the evening, the last guest had gone down the drive, and the house held the particular quiet of a space that has just emptied. Clara stood in the small sitting room off the main hall, the one with the green wallpaper and the deep window seat. She was looking out at the grounds of Hartwell in the early dark, the pale gravel path, the south lawn going from gray to black, the oak trees at the far end standing against the sky in the November night, bare and enormous and very clear. Nell found her there with Oliver asleep against her shoulder. "How are you?" Nell said. "Fine," Clara said. "Clara, actually, the venison was remarkable, and the pastry on the pudding was exceptional. I need to ask Mrs. Pritchard how she achieves that." Nell sat down in the armchair with the careful economy of a woman carrying a sleeping infant over uncertain ground. Oliver adjusted without waking, pressing his cheek more firmly against her shoulder. He was a remarkable sleeper. Clara had been admiring this about him since his birth. "He is a good man," Nell said carefully. "Edmund, I believe that." "He is a very good man," Clara said, and she meant it without reservation, because she did not say things she did not mean. "He is honest, and he manages his affairs responsibly, and he will never embarrass me publicly, or behave in ways that ruin families. These are not small things." "They are not," Nell agreed, "but they are a list of things he will not do. It is not the same as a list of things he will." Clara looked at her sister. Nell was 5 years younger and had married Geoffrey, who loved her in the slightly bewildered way of someone who cannot believe their luck, and they lived in Bristol, in a house with yellow curtains, and a dog who had eaten Geoffrey's hat twice and faced no consequences whatsoever. Clara had always found their happiness something she could not look at directly for very long, not because it was bad, but because looking at it for very long made very visible the specific difference between a life that fit you and a life you were learning to fit into. "I know what I have," Clara said. "I know exactly what it is. I chose it with open eyes." Nell looked at her for a moment, with the expression she had been wearing since the engagement was announced. Concern and love, in equal measure. The helplessness of a woman who is genuinely happy in her own life, and does not know what to do with a sister who has made a different calculation. Then she let it go, because Nell knew the difference between a door that had been left open and one that had been quietly but firmly closed, and she respected the difference. She stayed another 20 minutes, and then Geoffrey came, and they gathered Oliver, and the warm, ordinary life of them went out into the November evening, and Clara watched the lights of their car until the lane turned and took them out of sight. Later, in the room that was now her room, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and removed her hairpins one by one and placed them in a small dish on the dressing table. She counted without deciding to count. 12. Outside the window, the grounds of Hartwell lay in the full dark, and the moon was nearly complete, and the oak trees at the end of the south lawn were immense and bare and absolutely precise against the sky. She had said yes to Edmund's proposal 8 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in the drawing room of her parents' house in Dorset. He had asked directly and without ceremony, which she had expected, and he had told her plainly that he believed they would suit each other, that she was sensible and composed, and not given to scenes, and that a marriage built on honesty and mutual respect would be more durable than one built on feeling. He had said the word feeling with a slight careful distance, the way you say the name of a substance that has caused structural damage nearby. She had listened. She had looked at him across the small table, at his steady gray eyes, his careful hands, his face that communicated exactly what it intended, and no more, and she had thought, This man is being honest with me. He is telling me exactly what this is. There is no performance here. She had said yes. She picked up her hairbrush and drew it slowly through her hair. Long, even strokes. Her mother had taught her this when she was 6. You brush your hair before you go to sleep. It settles the day. She thought about the word he had used in the Dorset drawing room. Not sensible, not composed. The other one. Not given to scenes. He had meant it, as the highest kind of praise. She understood this completely. Sitting here, in this room, in this house. He had meant it the way you mean it, when you say a river is calm. It is not going to flood. It is not going to take anything with it. It will do what water is supposed to do, and it will do it reliably. A calm river is a good river. A calm river is what you want if you have built something on its banks that needs to stand. She had simply not understood, until this specific evening, that being described as calm was not the same as being seen. She set the brush down. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Brown hair loose around her shoulders, dark eyes that missed very little, a face that people trusted and did not always remember. She turned off the lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind in the oak trees. She felt the shape of the thing she had agreed to, and she held it without examining it too closely, the way you hold something in uncertain light until you find somewhere better to look at it. She fell asleep before she had decided what to think about it. That was probably the wisest thing she did on her wedding day. The house took her 2 weeks to learn. Hartwell House was complicated in the way that Old English houses are complicated. 4 generations of Ashfords had each added to it according to their different ideas, resulting in corridors that changed their width without announcement, staircases appearing around unexpected corners, and windows that looked out on aspects of the grounds that had no business being on that particular side of the building. But she moved through it with the patient, systematic attention she brought to anything she needed to understand, and by the end of the 2nd week, she had its logic. The staff had been there long enough to have their own rhythms. She did not arrive with changes. She arrived with attention. She learned their names on the first day and used them, and she thanked people specifically, and for specific things, rather than generally, and for general things. And this cost her nothing, and meant more to the people she thanked than she needed to explain. Within a week she knew that Mrs. Dowell the housekeeper had been at Hartwell for 19 years, and ran the household with the unhurried authority of someone who has learned a landscape well enough to move through it in the dark. Within 2 weeks, she knew that Amos the head gardener had been on the estate for 30 years, and had the particular relationship with the land that develops when you give 30 years of daily attention to something. Not knowledge exactly, but something closer to conversation. On her 3rd day, Amos walked her through the grounds. The kitchen garden, the orchard, the woodland at the back of the estate, and finally the south lawn with the oak trees at the far end. When she reached the oldest one, she stopped. It was vast. The word was not adequate, but it was what English offered. The canopy spread outward in all directions, with the circular authority of something that has been growing for a very long time, without anyone asking it to stop. The bark was deeply furrowed, and dark with age, and the lowest branches were as large in circumference as most trees would ever become entirely. "She's our elder," Amos said, standing beside her. Older than the house by a good margin. Before any of this was built, she was standing in the middle of open fields. People would have used her as a landmark for finding their way. Clara looked up through the bare November branches at the sky beyond. "How old would you say?" 260 years at the minimum. Could be more. Trees keep their own counsel about these things. She stood under the canopy for a long while without speaking. Amos waited. He was a man who understood that some things needed to be stood under before they could be understood. Edmund was not careless about her. He was simply occupied, in the full and literal sense of the word, with the management of an estate and a set of business interests that were significant and complex, and required his continuous focused attention. He came to dinner every evening, and he was civil and sometimes interesting, and he asked how she had spent her day, with the genuine consideration of a man who believes it is correct to ask, not the curiosity of a man who needs to know the answer. She told him the practical things. He received them with the approval he gave to information that confirmed correct functioning. She went to the green wallpaper room and sat in the window seat and said nothing, because she had always understood the difference between what was useful to say and what was not. The notebook appeared in the 4th month. She had not planned it. She was in the village on an errand for Mrs. Dowell, and she passed the stationer's, and the door was open, and she went in, and came out with a small brown notebook with plain covers and thick cream pages that felt good under her fingers. She put it in her coat pocket and carried it home, and that evening, while Edmund worked in his study, she opened it to the first page and wrote. She wrote, "The crack in the third pew at St. Giles was filled by someone who cared enough to fix it and not enough to match the color. I think about that person. I think they were someone who noticed things but was always slightly too busy to do them perfectly." She turned the page. She wrote, "Amos calls the oldest oak the elder. She was here before the house. She watched the whole thing go up, stone by stone. She has been watching the Ashford since before any living Ashford was born." She wrote every evening after that. The quality of light on the south lawn at different times of day. What the natural history books told her about old-growth woodland, about root systems that spread far underground beyond what anyone walking above could see. The names and lives of the tenants she had started visiting in October. Mrs. Burrows in the North Cottage, who ran her household with such thorough, quiet competence that it had become nearly invisible. Mr. Finch in the East Cottage, with his wall dispute and his one-eared cat named Captain. The long history of the dispute, which she was slowly reconstructing, and which was not really about the wall at all. When Edmund entered a room, she closed the notebook. Not dramatically, she simply closed it, the way you close something that belongs to you when someone enters your space. He passed it once on the dressing table and glanced at it. "Keeping accounts?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded and crossed to the mantelpiece for a letter. She looked at the closed notebook in her hands. She thought about what accounts were and what she was actually keeping, and how entirely different those two things were, and she filed the thought and went back to her writing. She was not keeping accounts. She was keeping herself. She was building, page by page in a small brown notebook, the interior evidence that she existed as someone specific, someone who noticed the color of old filler in a church pew, someone who knew the tree was a landmark before it was a landmark on someone's estate, someone who knew that the most capable person on the Hartwell land was a woman named Mrs. Burrows, whose husband had a bad back, and whose kitchen garden was going to be remarkable by summer. The winter settled fully into the house, and she added wool layers, and kept walking the grounds, and kept visiting the tenants, and kept filling the notebook. By December, she knew all 23 tenant families on the estate, their names, their children's names, their specific difficulties, and small triumphs. She wrote long letters to Nell every week, and Nell wrote back with Oliver and Geoffrey and the yellow curtains and the dog who had now progressed to chewing Geoffrey's second-best belt. Clara read these letters in the window seat and felt something she did not investigate closely. Not envy, precisely. Something closer to recognition. The way you recognize something through glass that you know the name of but cannot feel the weight of from where you are standing. The spring dinner party came, and she managed it with her usual careful attention. 14 guests, a seating arrangement that had taken her 2 days to work through properly. Food from Mrs. Pritchard that made 3 separate guests inquire discreetly about the cook's availability for private events. Clara sat at the far end of the table from Edmund and kept her half running, and noted things as she always noted things, and she was in conversation with Mrs. Harlow about apple varieties, when the atmosphere of the table shifted in a way she caught without quite knowing what she had caught. After the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Edmund stood in the entrance hall looking at the white lily arrangement on the hall table and said it in the easy tone of a man stating a simple fact. "You understand exactly what these evenings require. That was why I thought we would suit. You don't make things about yourself." She looked at the lilies. White, because white held in a cold room. "No," she said. "I don't." She picked up her shawl. She climbed the stairs. She closed the bedroom door behind her, with the precise, quiet click of a person who has chosen not to slam it, which is a statement made in a language that requires no audience. She went to the linen cupboard at the end of the corridor and reorganized the towels by size and material, which took 45 minutes and made no practical difference to anything, and which she discovered she had needed very much to do. She went to bed. Edmund was already asleep. She lay in the dark beside him and thought clearly and without self-pity about what he had said. He had not been unkind. He had been honest, which was what he had always been, which was clearly and without ornament. And what he had said clearly was that the thing he valued most in her was the smooth surface, the managed rooms, the right conversations, the absence of difficulty. He had not seen what it cost to maintain that surface, because he had not known to look below it. She lay in the dark and thought about the notebook and the tenants and the elder and the crack in the pew and the specific quality of Thursday afternoon light on the south lawn in December, which she had been trying to name for months without finding the right word. She thought about all of that, and she thought about what it meant to carry it in the interior she had been building, page by careful page, and have it received, at the end of every evening, as correct management. She thought about the difference between being approved of and being known. She sat with the difference. She did not rush it toward a resolution it was not ready for. Outside the window, the oak trees stood in the dark at the end of the south lawn, enormous and patient and entirely themselves, as they had been for 260 years, through every weather and every season and every version of the family that owned the house they had watched go up. She had always wanted to be that kind of certain, that kind of present. She was beginning to understand what it would cost. The winter moved through January and into February. In January it was the dramatic cold of bare trees and early dark. In February it was the harder cold, not dramatic but sustained, the cold of endurance, the cold of a thing that has been going on for a long time and has developed no interest in stopping. She moved through it with the same competence she brought to everything. She managed the house. She visited the tenants. She walked the grounds even on the bad days, because the walking had become necessary, in the way that some things become necessary. Not optional, not luxuries, but requirements, like air. She had found, in the natural history books, a section on the root systems of established oaks, and she had read it with the close attention she gave to things she actually loved, which was a different quality from the attention she gave to things she simply managed well. The books told her that the roots of an old oak can extend far beyond the visible canopy, sometimes twice as far, reaching outward underground in all directions, occupying space that no one above the surface could measure or even imagine. The tree you saw was only the part of it you were allowed to see. The rest was underneath, doing most of the actual work, invisible and essential, and there whether anyone noticed it or not. She had read this 3 times, and then closed the book and sat with it. In the second week of February she woke before Edmund, on a morning of gray early light, and lay looking at the ceiling, and had the kind of thought that arrives in the early morning, before the day's management begins, clear and cold, and not asking permission. She had been at Hartwell for 15 months. She had learned every inch of it. She had loved it, in the way she had come to understand. You love something when you learn it carefully enough. Not the sudden love of a first impression, but the durable love of accumulated understanding. She had learned the people, and the land, and the light, and the trees. She had made Hartwell as much hers as it could be made, which was considerable, because she was very good at making things hers. And Edmund would not know, if she left, that the third step on the back staircase had a loose board that sounded alarming, but was not serious. He would not know that Mrs. Burroughs's kitchen garden was the best producing on the estate. He would not know the name Amos had given the oldest oak, or that Captain the One-Eared Cat had progressed from outright contempt to something that on Sunday mornings in the second drawing room might generously be called companionship. She lay in the gray light and held this thought without flinching. He was a good man, he was honest and responsible, and he said well done when she did things well, which she always did, and she believed he meant it, which was not nothing. But there was a kind of loneliness, she was discovering, that did not come from being alone. It came from being present every day to someone who could see the outline of you and call it by a name and believe that was the same as knowing you. She got up quietly, so as not to wake him. She went to the dressing table and took the notebook from the drawer. She went to the window seat and sat with it on her knee and looked out at the south lawn in the February morning. The elder stood at the far end in the near dark, enormous and patient and simply, utterly herself, the way she had been for 260 years. Clara opened the notebook to a blank page. She held the pen. She did not write yet. She thought first, which was what she always did. She knew the thing completely before she wrote it. What she knew was this: she was going to have to make a decision. Not today. Perhaps not for several weeks. But the decision was already made in the part of her that made real decisions first, and then informed the rest of her afterward, which was, she had come to understand, where she actually lived. She closed the notebook. she put it back in the drawer. She went downstairs and made tea, and set the breakfast things. And when Edmund came down, she handed him his cup, and he said thank you, without looking up from the letter he was already reading. And she sat across from him, and looked at the top of his head, and thought, I know what I need to do. I know exactly what it is. She drank her tea. The morning light came in through the east windows, in long pale bars across the table. She thought about mountains. She did not know exactly why she thought about mountains. She had not been to one in 10 years, not since a holiday in the Lake District the summer before her mother got ill. But the thought arrived fully formed and stayed, somewhere with height to it, somewhere you could stand and see from. She noted it. She moved on. She did not say it out loud, but it stayed. The decision did not announce itself loudly. It did not arrive in a single moment of clarity, like a door flying open. It came the way most true decisions come, in layers, each one adding to the weight of the thing, until the thing could no longer be carried as a question, and had to become an answer. In the days after the February morning, with the notebook, she watched herself with the careful attention she had always given to things she needed to understand. And what she saw was someone who had arrived at a threshold without quite crossing it yet. She was still managing everything with the same competence. The house ran, the dinners happened, the tenants were visited, the notebook was filled. But something underneath that surface had shifted, the way ice shifts in late winter, quietly and without announcement, simply because its time has come. She began making small preparations, and she made them the way she made everything, in order, without drama, ensuring that each step was complete before moving to the next. The first step was the letter to Nell, not the usual letter. This one was different, and she wrote it carefully in the green wallpaper room on a Tuesday evening, while Edmund worked in his study, drafting it 3 times, before she reached a version that was true enough, and clear enough, and concerned enough with Nell's feelings to be sent. She began with the kitchen garden and Captain, and what Mrs. Burrows had told her about the best way to support bean plants against the fell winds. This was not dishonesty. This was easing the way in. And then she arrived at the paragraph she had been building toward. She told Nell she was going away for a while. Not in crisis, she said. She used those words deliberately, knowing Nell would reach for worry first, and needing to give her something real to hold instead. She told her she was going to the cottage in Cumbria that had belonged to their grandmother, which she had quietly confirmed was still standing through Mrs. Dowell's cousin, who lived in Penrith and knew the area. She told Nell she was going because she needed to be somewhere that was hers, in a way that Hartwell, for all that she had learned it and cared for it, and made it as much her own as it could be made, had never quite managed to be. And the reason it had never quite managed it was itself the reason she needed to go. She sealed the letter. She posted it herself on one of her walking days, walking the extra mile into the village and back so that Edmund would not see it leave the house. The second step was Miss Agnes Holt in London, her solicitor, a small, neat woman, with the manner of someone who has heard everything, and found most of it considerably less alarming than her clients did. Clara wrote her a letter, outlining her situation and what she needed to know, which was not how to end anything, but how to understand her position clearly. And Miss Holt wrote back within the fortnight with exactly that. Her position, legal and financial, set out plainly and without editorializing. Clara read it at the breakfast table, with Edmund across from her reading the morning paper, and she noted what it said, and filed it where she filed things she might need later. And she poured herself more tea, and looked out the window at the kitchen garden and thought, good, now I know where I stand. The third step was the letter to the land agent for the Cumbrian property, confirming that the cottage could be accessed, that the key was where Mrs. Dowell's cousin said it was, that the roof and the basic structure were sound. The agent confirmed all of this and added, with the slight puzzlement of someone dealing with an unusual request, that the cottage had been unoccupied since the old Mrs. Whitmore had died 6 years ago and would need considerable work to be comfortable. Clara wrote back to say that she understood this and would manage it. The fourth step was packing. She packed 1 bag. This took 40 minutes, which was longer than packing 1 bag should take, because she kept removing things and putting them back as she thought through what she was actually going to need, as opposed to what she was accustomed to having. The distinction was useful and clarifying. She needed warm clothes, boots, her notebooks, she had filled 3 by now, and the 4 natural history volumes from Edmund's library that she had been reading. which she was taking without asking, and would return when she returned. She needed her personal papers and the small amount of money that was specifically hers. She did not need much else. She left out the evening things, the social things, the things that had been doing the job of making her look correct. She looked at them in the wardrobe and thought about what they were for, and decided that where she was going, they were not for anything. One bag, in the end. Set by the bedroom door the night before. Edmund did not see it. He worked late in his study that evening, and when he came to bed, she was already lying with her eyes closed, and she listened to the familiar sounds of him preparing for bed. The cufflinks on the dressing table, the specific way he draped his jacket over the chair, the click of the bathroom light. And she lay very still, and let the sounds be the last things she noted about ordinary evenings at Hartwell. She did not sleep much, not from distress. She was surprisingly calm, the calm of someone who has made a decision and is on the right side of it, but simply because she was awake and thinking was something she found more interesting than sleeping when there was enough to think about. She had written Edmund's letter 4 times and burned 3 versions in the fireplace of the green wallpaper room. The 4th version was on the hall table now, weighted down by the small china salt cellar, shaped like a swan, that had sat on that table since before any living person at Hartwell could remember. She had always liked that salt cellar. She had left it on the table rather than putting it somewhere for safekeeping, because she was not taking things away from Hartwell. She was simply leaving. The letter said, "Edmund, I am going to the cottage in Cumbria that belonged to my grandmother. I am not in any danger. I have made this decision carefully, and without anger, because I am someone who makes decisions carefully, and what I am doing now is consistent with who I am, which is something I think you may not fully know yet, and that is partly what this is about. I am more than you were looking for when you asked me to marry you. I know you did not intend this as a limitation. I know you were not unkind. But I have spent 15 months learning this house, and this land, and these people, and I have learned them with everything I have, and what I have found is that I cannot be fully visible to someone who is not looking for what I actually am. I wish you well, and I mean that without reservation. Please see to it that Mrs. Burrows in the North Cottage has what she needs for the kitchen garden this spring. The seed order she will need is in the red folder on the desk in the estate room. I put it there last week. And do not let Captain sit on the second drawing room windowsill unsupervised. He has developed strong opinions about the curtains. She had signed it simply, Clara, not your wife. Her name. She was Clara before she was a wife, and she would be Clara whether or not she was a wife, and it seemed important to establish that clearly in a letter that was, among other things, an act of clarity. At 5 in the morning she got up and dressed in the dark. She moved around the room with the careful quietness of someone who knows every creak of the floor and where to step to avoid them, which she did, because she had been learning this house for 15 months, and she knew its floorboards as well as she knew its tenant families. She washed her face. She put on her warmest coat. She put on her walking boots. She picked up the one bag by the bedroom door. She stood in the room for a moment. Edmund was asleep, with his face turned slightly away, one hand flat on the pillow. The particular even breathing of someone who sleeps well and always has. She looked at him for a moment in the dark. She did not feel anything she did not expect to feel, which was the most honest accounting she could give. She went out. She went down the back staircase, stepping over the 3rd step, not because she was trying to be silent, but because the 3rd step made a sound that would alert Mrs. Dowell's room at the end of the servants' corridor, and she did not want Mrs. Dowell to be alerted. She went through the kitchen, which smelled of last night's bread and the faint coal smell of the range, and she went out through the back door and around the side of the house to the front drive. The morning was cold and completely dark, except for the moonlight, which was not quite full, but nearly, and which made the gravel drive pale and very clear ahead of her. She could see the lane at the far end. She could see the oak trees at the end of the south lawn, the elder, enormous against the sky, her bare branches precise in the winter moonlight. Clara stopped for a moment and looked at the elder. 260 years. She had been here before the house, and she would be here after it. She had watched the Ashfords go about their business since before any living Ashford was born. She had watched Clara Whitmore arrive with one white dress and a hairbrush, and a capacity for attention that no one on this estate had yet understood the full extent of. She would be here to watch what happened next. Clara picked up her bag. She turned toward the lane. She did not look back at the house, not because she had no feeling for it. She had a great deal of feeling for it. She had loved it carefully, and specifically, for 15 months. But because looking back was not what she was doing. She was going forward. Looking back while going forward was a habit she had never seen the use of. She walked down the drive. The gravel crunched under her boots. The moonlight made everything pale and clear. At the end of the drive, she turned onto the lane and began walking toward the village and the early coach that would take her to the railway town, and from there the train north, and from there another coach, and from there her own feet, on a track that a coachman would later tell her was not, in his professional opinion, a proper road. She reached the village as the first gray light was arriving in the sky to the east. The bakery had its lights on. Mrs. Henley started early, as she always had, and the smell of fresh bread came out under the door as Clara passed, and she noted it and kept walking. The coach was at the bottom of the village square. One other passenger, a man in a traveling coat who nodded at her and then opened a newspaper. She put her bag up and sat down, and the coach moved off at 5:15 into the cold gray English morning, and behind her, Fen Hollow fell away down the lane, and Hartwell House, with its 4 generations of Ashfords, and its 23 tenant families, and its south lawn, and its great oak trees, fell away with it. She did not feel what she expected to feel, which had been something large and significant. What she felt was the particular calm of someone who has done what she needed to do, and is now facing the immediate practical question of what comes next. What came next was the train, and then the second coach, and then the track that was not, in the coachman's professional opinion, a road. She looked out the window at the English countryside going past in the early light, fields and hedgerows, and the occasional village, bare winter trees against a sky that was beginning to decide it might eventually become daylight, and she thought about her grandmother's cottage, on the edge of the Cumbrian fell. She thought about what it would be like to arrive somewhere she had inherited, and to learn it the way she had learned Hartwell, from the beginning, from the first creak of the floor, from the first morning of light through windows she was learning for the first time. She thought about the word her grandmother had used when she had told her, years ago, that she was leaving the cottage to her specifically. "You'll know what to do with it," she had said. "The others would leave it. You'll stay with it until you understand it." Her grandmother had known something about her then that she had not yet known about herself. She was beginning to understand what it was. She opened her notebook, the newest one, not quite full, and she wrote, "I am on the coach to the railway town. It is 5:15 in the morning and the sky is beginning. I have 1 bag and 4 books and myself, and I am going to learn what that is sufficient for." She read it back. She thought it was probably sufficient for a great deal. She closed the notebook. She looked out the window. The morning was coming in faster now, the sky going from gray to pale to something approaching light, and the countryside was waking into itself, and she was moving through it, and the day was hers, in a way that no day at Hartwell had ever entirely been. She breathed. She let it be. Edmund found the letter at breakfast, as she had known he would. He was a man of very fixed morning habits. He came down at 7:15. He poured his coffee from the pot Mrs. Dowell left ready on the sideboard. He picked up the morning paper, and any correspondence on the hall table on his way past. He would have seen the envelope with his name on it before he reached the dining room. He would have recognized her handwriting. He would have set his coffee down and opened it and read it. She was not there to see it. She was on the train, moving north through England, watching the landscape change, as it always does when you go north. The fields wider, the sky bigger, the trees lower and more determined looking, as if they have made a decision about the weather and the wind and have committed to it. Edmund would have read the letter at the dining room table. He would have read it more than once. He would have set it down very precisely in the center of the table, the way he set things down when he was thinking, and he would have sat with the thinking in the way he did everything, quietly, methodically, without showing it. She did not know what he would have thought. She did not spend much time guessing, because she had learned that guessing at other people's interior lives was less useful than attending to your own, and her own was currently fully occupied with the landscape going past outside the train window and the question of what the cottage would look like when she arrived. She arrived in the early afternoon of the second day, having taken the train to Penrith and then a coach to the edge of Brackenmore, the small fell village nearest to the cottage. The coachman was a local man named Daniel, who drove with the comfortable certainty of someone who has driven these roads for 30 years and regards them as his personal property. When they reached the lane that turned off toward the fell and the cottage, he stopped the coach. "That track up there," he said, in the direction of the lane. "It's not a road, really. Not for a coach." "That's fine," she said. "I have boots." He looked at her bag. He looked at her boots. He looked at the track, which wound steeply up the fell, in the manner of something that had decided to become a track gradually, and never quite committed. Then he looked at her again. "Right then," he said. She climbed down with her bag and started up the track. The fell opened above her immediately, which was the first thing that the fells did to you. They made you understand instantly that you were small, and the landscape was large, and that this was not a negotiable relationship. She had forgotten, in the years since the Lake District holiday, how a high place felt. Not small, exactly. More like correctly sized. The actual size of a person, without the inflation that social situations impose. She walked. The track was steep and loose-stoned in places, and she had to pay attention to where she put her feet, which was fine, because paying attention was what she did. Around a granite outcrop, and up a steeper section, and around another bend, and then there it was. The cottage, low and stone-built, and sitting on the edge of the fell, with the particular solidity of something that has weathered several hundred years of fell weather, and has developed a settled opinion about it. 2 windows facing the track, a door that had once been green, and was now the ghost of green, the color bleached and faded to something that the actual color could not quite claim. A low stone wall enclosing a square of ground that had been a garden at some point, and was currently engaged in returning itself to fell. She found the key under the 3rd flat stone from the left, inside the garden gate, exactly where she had been told it would be. She stood there for a moment holding it. 3rd from the left. The specificity of it, the trusting certainty that if you told someone it was under the 3rd stone from the left, they would find the 3rd stone and look under it, and the key would be there, was something she found deeply satisfying. She opened the door and went in. The cottage was cold in the thorough way of a building unheated for months, and dusty in the way of a building unoccupied, and it smelled of old stone and old wood, and something faintly herbal, that she thought was lavender, that had been drying here for 6 years, still leaving its trace. The main room held a fireplace, and a stone floor, and a table with 3 chairs, and shelves along one wall, with her grandmother's books still in place, spines to the room, waiting for whoever came next. She stood in the middle of it. The room was hers. Not in the borrowed sense, the way Hartwell had been hers, a fit without being a shape. This was hers in the actual sense, left to her, specifically by a woman who had understood something about her that she was only now beginning to understand about herself. She said, to the empty room, "Right," and began. She found wood stacked under a tarpaulin at the side of the house, weighted down with flat stones in the manner of someone who understood fell weather, which was her grandmother's manner entirely. She carried an armload inside. She knelt at the fireplace. She had never built a fire by herself. She had always lived in houses where fires were built by other people, which had seemed entirely natural until this moment, kneeling on a stone floor with wood in her hands, when it seemed like a very significant gap in her practical education. She built it according to what she understood fires to need: paper at the bottom, small sticks above it, larger wood above that, enough air for the thing to breathe. She lit the paper. It went out. She looked at what had failed. The small sticks were too large and too close together. She tried again, this time with smaller sticks and more space between them. It caught, briefly, and then went out. She sat back on her heels and looked at the unlit grate, and thought carefully about what fire actually required, which was heat and fuel and air, in the right proportions, and what proportion she was getting wrong. She thought she was not leaving enough air between the small sticks for the heat to build before the larger wood smothered it. 3rd attempt, smaller paper, smaller kindling, more space. She lit the corner of the paper and held her breath. The fire caught. It grew. It held. She stayed on her heels watching it until she was completely certain, which took longer than it should have because she had learned something about fires in the last 20 minutes, which was that they were more fragile than they appeared and needed to be watched until they had made up their minds. When this one had clearly made up its mind, she sat back and looked at the small warm light filling the cold room, and felt something she was not expecting. It was not grand. It was not the dramatic warmth of a revelation. It was something smaller and more specific. The precise satisfaction of having done something badly twice, and then correctly, through attention and persistence, without anyone to help or observe. The fire did not care that this was her first time. The fire was simply burning because she had made it burn. The cold room was warmer because she had made it warmer. She sat on the hearthrug and looked at the fire and thought, I can learn this too. I can learn all of this. She ate what she had brought, bread and hard cheese and an apple, and a jar of Mrs. Pritchard's blackcurrant jam that she had taken from the larder without asking, which she felt marginally guilty about and not guilty enough to regret. And she ate at the table with the fire going, and the cold room slowly warming around her. And she looked at her grandmother's books on the shelf and felt, for the first time in longer than she could immediately identify, exactly where she was. She went to bed early, on the small iron bed under the eaves, with the mattress Mrs. Dowell's cousin had aired, and found adequate. She pulled the blankets around herself in the cold room, and looked at the dark ceiling, and listened to the fell wind, which was a different wind from the wind at Hartwell, larger and more certain of itself, with more room in which to be what it was. And she fell asleep before she had finished thinking about it. In the morning, she built the fire on the second attempt, which was progress. She ate breakfast, standing at the kitchen window looking at the garden, which was even more occupied with its own business than she had realized in the previous evening's light. An entire corner had been surrendered to bramble, which had moved in with the comfortable confidence of something that expects no resistance. The raised beds had gone soft at the edges. The ghost of order was visible if you looked for it. The lines of old beds, the remains of cane supports, the rusted fork handle standing upright near the back wall, like a small monument to someone's intention. But the intention had lapsed, and the fell had been moving in since. She put on her coat and her grandmother's gardening gloves, which were too large for her hands, and smelled of earth, in the specific way of tools that had been used for real work, and she went outside. She went to the bramble first. This was a decision based on priorities. The bramble was the thing that would take everything else if it was not stopped, and stopping it required beginning immediately. She started pulling. The bramble had opinions about staying. Its roots went deep and wide, and did not let go without an argument, and she had to dig for them and lever them out section by section. And it was not elegant work, and she was not good at it yet. But she kept going, and by the end of 2 hours the corner was not clear, but was substantially diminished in its ambitions. She stood back and looked at what she had done. Her back ached from the angle of the work. Her hands were hot inside the 2 large gloves. There was mud on her knees from where she had knelt on the wet ground without thinking. The corner was better. Not finished, but better. She felt extraordinarily well. This was the thing she discovered, standing in the March morning, with mud on her knees and a corner of ground partially reclaimed. That certain kinds of work gave back more than they cost. Not the work she had been doing at Hartwell. That work was real, and she had done it well, and it had been right to do. But this kind of work, physical and specific, and entirely hers, gave something back that was different. It went in through her hands, and came back through her whole body, as something she could not immediately name, but which felt like what she imagined fuel felt like to a fire, something that made you more, rather than less. She went inside and made tea, and then went back out and worked until the light went at 4 in the afternoon. And that night she slept, as she had not slept in months. Deep and total, and without the soft vigilance she had maintained for 15 months, in a house she was always managing, always listening for, always ready to attend to. Brackenmore was a village of 200 people arranged along a main street that had begun as a track between 2 farms several centuries ago, and had developed into a street gradually and without much planning. It had a post office that also sold bread and tinned goods, and, in the front window, a display of locally made jam that had not been updated since the previous autumn. It had a general store run by a man named Archie Dean, who had the patient eyes of someone who has been selling people what they need for 30 years, and has developed a quiet philosophy about it. It had a public house called the Fell Arms that had been in the same family for 4 generations, and served 2 kinds of beer and very good pies, and did not encourage strangers to linger, but did not actively discourage it either. The people of Brackenmore had the particular quality of fell villages, which was that they watched before they spoke, and formed opinions slowly, and held them firmly once formed. They had noticed Clara within the first day. A woman alone arriving at the Whitmore cottage was not nothing in a village of this size, and they were watching her the way they watched all new things, with the patient attention of people who have learned that most things reveal themselves eventually, if you give them enough time. She went to the post office on her third day to send letters. The woman behind the counter was Margaret Fell, who was 50-something, with the red complexion of a woman who spends considerable time outdoors, short silver hair, and eyes that made a rapid assessment of Clara in the space of a single glance. "The Whitmore cottage," Margaret Fell said. It was not entirely a question. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. It was my grandmother's." "I know whose it was," Margaret Fell said, and stamped Clara's letters with an efficiency that suggested she had opinions about wasted time. "We were glad when someone finally came. It's been sitting empty 6 years. Buildings don't do well, sitting empty." "No," Clara said. "I don't think they do." Margaret Fell looked at her for a moment. "You'll want to know about firewood," she said. "George Abbott does the deliveries up your track. He'll try to charge you the tourist rate. Tell him you're a resident." "Am I a resident?" Clara said. "You're here," Margaret Fell said. "That counts, in Brackenmore." Clara told George Abbott she was a resident when he came on Friday with the firewood. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression of a man who has learned that people arriving at Fell cottages from elsewhere have a complex relationship with the truth about their status. And then he nodded and charged her the resident rate and spent 15 minutes telling her about the track, which was, in his opinion, in a condition that was going to become a serious problem before the autumn rains, if something was not done about it. "What would it take to get it properly graded?" she said. He told her. They stood in the fell wind, discussing it with the practical focus of two people who both have a stake in the same concrete problem, and she liked him immediately, the way she liked people who said what they meant and expected the same in return. She planted the garden in the last week of March. She had ordered seeds by post from a merchant in Penrith, whose catalogue she had found in her grandmother's kitchen drawer, a detailed thing full of variety descriptions that suggested the merchant had strong opinions about heritage vegetables, which Clara found appealing. She wrote him a letter specifying exactly what she wanted and why, with notes on the soil conditions as she had found them and what she thought they needed. And he wrote back with her order and 2 extra packets of a heritage bean variety he said had been hard to find for years, and which he believed she would appreciate, given what she had told him about the soil. She did appreciate it. She sent him a thank you card. The work of planting was different from the work of clearing. Clearing was about removing what was wrong. Planting was about putting in what should be there and then trusting it, which required a different kind of attention. Not the forceful attention of someone removing an obstacle, but the quiet attention of someone who has done what they can and is now watching and waiting and trying not to interfere with the process. She was not very good at the waiting part. She went out to the garden several times a day in the first week after planting, checking the soil and looking for the first signs of germination, with a diligence that she recognized as excessive but could not entirely suppress. She had done something, and she wanted to know if it was working. Archie Dean at the general store told her, with the measured kindness of someone who does not want to discourage, but also does not want to mislead, that most of what she had planted would take 2 to 3 weeks to show itself. "Soil's still cold," he said. "Give it time. Things come when they're ready." She went back to her notebook and her natural history books, and her grandmother's small collection of books on the shelf in the main room, which she had been working through systematically in the evenings. Her grandmother had had interesting taste in books, not fashionable taste, but the taste of someone who read for genuine information and genuine feeling, and did not much care what other people thought of her choices. There were 3 volumes of fell walking guides, so old and detailed they read almost like natural history. There were 2 books about dry stone walling, one practical and one almost philosophical. There was a collection of essays about the hill farming life of the previous century that was so vividly and exactly written that Clara read it twice in the first week. She was reading about dry stone walling on a Tuesday evening in the second week when she understood why the book was almost philosophical. Dry stone walling was about finding the right stone for the right place, not cutting the stone to fit the gap, but learning the gap well enough that you could find the stone that already fitted it. You did not impose the structure. You discovered it. The structure was already there in the stone, and the job of the person building the wall was to see it and make it visible. She sat with this for a long time. Then she wrote it in the notebook. Then she looked at what she had written and thought about walls and people and what it meant to find the thing that fit, rather than cutting something to fit a space that had been decided without it. The notebook was nearly full by the end of March. She had started a new one at the beginning of the month, and this one was filling faster than the others because she was writing differently here. Not the measured, carefully edited entries she had written at Hartwell, where she had always been aware of the possibility of Edmund glancing at the page, but something freer and more immediate, the actual velocity of her thinking, uncensored and unperformed. She wrote about the fell and the cottage and the village and the people she was coming to know. She wrote about the bramble and the fire, and what 3 attempts at a fire had taught her about paying attention to what something actually needed, rather than what you assumed it needed. She wrote about what her body felt like after a day of physical work, which was tired in the specific, satisfied way of someone who has used themselves for what they were for. She wrote about the quality of fell light in the early morning, which was unlike any light she had encountered at Hartwell, hard and clear and honest, as if it had traveled a long way and arrived with something to say. She wrote about what she was discovering about herself, which was the most important thing in the notebook, and the thing she would have been least able to write at Hartwell. She was discovering that she was someone who needed to be cold sometimes. She was discovering that she was someone who needed physical work, not as exercise, not as a scheduled thing, but as a real engagement with the world. Hands in the earth, wood in her arms, the specific grammar of things that required her body, as well as her mind. She was discovering that she was someone who could be alone for long stretches, without loneliness, because she was very good company for herself, and that she had never known this before, because she had never given herself long enough alone to find out. She wrote to Nell every week without fail. The Brackenmore letters were different from the Hartwell letters, longer, more open, written with a different energy, as if the letters themselves could feel the change in the landscape they were written in. She wrote about the fire, and the bramble, and the seed order, and Margaret Fell, and George Abbott, and Archie Dean, and the track situation, and the natural history of the fell, which she was reading about extensively, and walking about daily, and finding endlessly interesting. She wrote about what the solitude felt like, which was not what she had expected it to feel like. She had expected solitude to be the absence of something. Instead, it felt like the presence of something, something that had been waiting for enough quiet to make itself known. Nell wrote back with Oliver, who had said his first word, and Jeffrey, who had responded to this by ordering a picture book about dogs that he claimed was for Oliver, but which Nell suspected was partly for Jeffrey, and the yellow curtains, and the dog, who had now eaten an entire gardening glove, in addition to the historical hat situation. She wrote at the end, "I can tell from your letters that you are not in crisis, but in the opposite of crisis, which I do not have a name for, but which I have been hoping for on your behalf for some time. Take the time you need. Come when you are ready. I love you." Clara read this at the table with the fire going, and felt the warmth of being known move through her like something physical. That was what it felt like, being seen by someone who was actually looking. Physical. Specific. Like warmth from a fire you built yourself. She folded the letter. She put it in the drawer with the notebooks. She went back to the garden. The seeds had started to show by the end of the second week, exactly as Archie Dean had said they would. First the quickest ones, the radishes and the salad leaves, tiny green threads emerging from the soil, with the quiet insistence of things that have decided the time has come. She stood over them in the April morning, looking at them with something she recognized from the natural history books, as the feeling the books called wonder, which she had always thought of as a slightly excessive word, but which turned out to be accurate, when you were looking at something that was alive, because you had created the conditions for it to be alive. She was also, by April, considerably better at most of the physical skills the cottage required. She built fires on the first attempt every morning, and had moved on to building better fires that burned cleanly and evenly, and required less tending. She had reset 3 sections of the stone wall around the garden, using what the philosophical dry stone wall book had taught her, which was to look for the stone that fit the gap, rather than forcing one. She had established a workable routine for the cottage, when to clean, and when not to bother, how to manage the water from the fell spring, when the track was passable in what weather. She had also, more slowly and with more resistance from herself, learned to accept help. Margaret Fell had sent her son round with a spare pane of glass for the kitchen window after she mentioned the draft, without being asked. Archie Dean had taken to setting aside the good bread for her, which arrived at the shop early and was gone by 9. George Abbott had graded the top section of the track on a Thursday morning simply because he was going past with his equipment, and the state of it had been bothering him. She had thanked all of them properly and specifically. She had not made a fuss about any of it, because they had not made a fuss. And making a fuss in Brackenmore was, she had learned, considered a significant social error. You accepted help, you thanked people, you helped back when you could. That was how it worked. The solicitor's letter from Edmund's side arrived in the 4th week. She had been expecting something of this kind, and was not surprised by it. She opened it at the breakfast table, and read it, and noted what it was asking, which was her address and a general statement of her intentions, wrapped in the formally courteous language of a firm that had been dealing with Ashford matters for 3 generations, and knew how to wrap things. She read it twice, and used it to start the morning fire, because the coal in the kitchen range was running low, and paper was useful. She wrote to Miss Agnes Holt in London to inform her that a response might be appropriate, and to ask for her guidance on the form it should take. Miss Holt wrote back within 10 days, with a clear-headed letter that confirmed her position, and suggested a brief, neutral response that communicated her current situation, without committing to anything she was not yet ready to commit to. Clara wrote the response, which said that she was in Cumbria, at the Whitmore family cottage, that she was well, and that she would communicate further when she was ready. She sent it. She did not know exactly what she was not ready for. She knew she was not ready for the conversation about what came next, and she was honest with herself about the reason, which was that she did not yet know what she wanted to come next. She had known, with total clarity, that she needed to leave Hartwell. She had not yet arrived at the same clarity about anything beyond that, and she had enough respect for clarity, genuine clarity, the kind that comes from full attention rather than forced decision, to wait for it. She was also, she admitted to herself on a clear April morning, standing at the top of the fell, with the wind coming over the ridge, and the valley laid out below her, and the sky, enormous above, in the process of becoming someone she had not yet finished becoming, and she thought it would be unwise to make decisions about the rest of her life before that process was complete. She could wait. Waiting was something she was very good at, waiting attentively, without fidgeting, without forcing, the same patience she brought to the seeds in the garden, to the fire on the 3rd attempt, to Captain's progression from contempt to what might be called companionship. She turned away from the view and started back down toward the cottage, walking with the sure-footed ease she had developed over weeks of daily fell walking, and she thought, I will know when I know. I have always known things when I knew them, and not before. This is no different. The fell stretched around her, enormous and patient, and full of its own business, and she walked through it and felt, as she had started to feel most days, that the business was hers too, not because she owned it, because no one owned this, but because she was paying it the attention that made things yours. The letter from Nell arrived in the 2nd week of April, and it said, among other things, Edmund came to see Geoffrey last Tuesday. Geoffrey was very careful about what he said to me about it afterward, which tells me he was asked to be careful. Geoffrey has never been careful about anything in his life without being specifically asked, which means Edmund asked him. I am telling you this not because I think you should do anything about it, but because you should know that things are moving on his side as well, and that whatever you decide, the space you have in which to decide it may be shorter than you think. Clara read this twice, and then put it in the drawer with the others. She went out to the garden and worked for 2 hours. She pulled the last of the winter debris from the far bed and turned the soil and added the compost from the bin she had established in the corner where the bramble had been. The work was good and physical, and it took her full attention, which was what she needed. When she came back inside, she made tea and sat at the table, and she thought about Edmund, which was the first time she had given herself permission to think about him properly, with full attention, in the weeks since she had arrived. She thought about what she knew about him. She knew he was a man who did things correctly. She knew he was honest, genuinely honest, in the way that some people are honest, because it is the right thing, and they have a clear enough view of themselves to see when they are not doing it. She knew he had married her for reasons he had stated plainly and without deception, and that those reasons were real, and that he had meant everything he said. She knew he had looked at her and seen someone useful and capable and steady, and that he had meant this as the highest compliment, and that meaning it as the highest compliment was not the same as it being sufficient. She thought about what she did not know about him. She did not know what he had thought when he read the letter on the hall table. She did not know what he had done after reading it. She did not know whether the conversation with Jeffrey had been an attempt to locate her, or an attempt to understand something, or simply an attempt to manage a situation that was not managing itself. She did not know whether he was capable of the thing she needed, which was not a grand gesture, and not a dramatic change, and not even an apology, although an apology was probably part of it. What she needed was simpler and harder than any of those things. She needed him to look, actually look, with the full attention he gave to things he considered important, at who she was, and what she had been doing for 15 months while he was looking at something else. She did not know if he could do that. She was honest about this. She did not know. She looked at the garden through the kitchen window. The seeds were showing in all 4 beds now, green threads of intention pushing up through the soil she had prepared. They were doing what they were made to do, because the conditions had been made right for them. She thought, conditions matter. The right conditions can make possible things that the wrong conditions make impossible. The question is not only what the person is capable of, but what they have been given conditions to discover they are capable of. She had not given Edmund conditions to discover anything. She had maintained the smooth surface for 15 months, and given him no friction, and no resistance, and no reason to look deeper than the surface, because she had genuinely believed, that the smooth surface was what was required, and it was what was required. But requiring it every day, indefinitely, without interruption, was a different thing from what she had believed she was signing up for. She put the thought in the notebook. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote, I am beginning to think that the question is not whether to go back, but whether what I would be going back to could be different enough from what I left to be worth going back to. She read this back. She thought, that is the actual question. Everything else is managing around it. She got up and went back to the garden. The seeds were doing what seeds did. The fell was doing what fells did. The sky was the sky. She dug her hands into the dark-turned soil and felt the cold of it and the specific texture of it and thought, I am here. This is mine. Whatever I decide, this is mine. She stayed in the garden until the light went. In the morning there was rain, a fell rain that came horizontal over the ridge and hit the kitchen window like something with a grievance, and she built the fire and made her tea and read the dry stone wall book and did not go outside until the afternoon, when the rain eased to the kind of drizzle that was not really rain, but was not really not rain either, which she had come to understand was simply the fell's default setting between actual rain events. She put on her waterproof coat and her boots, and she went out and walked up the track and along the ridge path she had found in the second week, which ran along the shoulder of the fell, with the valley on one side and the open high ground on the other. She walked until she reached the cairn at the top of the first rise, where she always stopped to look in all directions and let the fell do what it did to her, which was make her the actual size of a person. She stood at the cairn and looked at the valley below in the rain, the village small and clear, the fields in their various states of spring, and she thought about size and what it meant, and whether there was a version of her life in which she could be the actual size of a person and also have the rest of it, the house and the estate, and the man who was learning, perhaps, to look. She thought, perhaps the question is not whether I go back. Perhaps the question is who I go back as. She stood at the cairn for a long time in the drizzle that was not quite rain, and the fell was enormous around her, and very honest about it, and she let the thinking settle into something quieter. Then she walked back down toward the cottage, sure-footed and steady, and went inside and built up the fire, and made supper, and wrote in her notebook until late. And the sentence she wrote at the end of the evening was, I think I am becoming ready. I am not ready yet, but the direction is right. The dinner party happened in the 3rd week of November, 18 months into the marriage, and Clara managed it the way she managed all of them, with the thorough, invisible competence that Edmund had told 3 separate guests was the thing he had known she would be good at before she arrived. She should clarify that she had not yet left Hartwell when the dinner party happened. She had been building toward it for weeks, with the slow, private accumulation that real decisions require, but she had not yet reached the threshold. The dinner party was one of the things that pushed her closer. 12 guests. A Thursday evening, which Edmund preferred for business-adjacent dinners because Thursday had a quality, he had once explained, of being far enough into the week to be considered, but not so close to the weekend, as to feel celebratory. She had noted this, and she had thought, I have learned the way his mind works so thoroughly that I can predict his calendar preferences, and yet I could not tell you anything specific that he has noticed about me. She had placed the guests with her usual care. The seating was a kind of architecture. She had come to think of it that way, and she had the talent for it that came from paying close attention to people and understanding what they needed and what they found difficult. She placed the difficult ones next to the ones who could manage difficulty without effort. She placed the shy ones next to the ones who spoke generously and did not require reciprocation. She placed herself next to the two guests she had assessed as likely to be most useful to Edmund's business interests, because she had learned that her job at these dinners was partly to extend Edmund's reach to the people he could not sit next to himself. The dinner went well. The food was exceptional. Mrs. Pritchard had developed, over the months, a quality of excellence that was almost alarming, as if the scale of the kitchen at Hartwell had given her room to become something she had only partly been in London. The wine was better than the food. The conversation moved in the way it moved at these tables, layered and careful, and occasionally genuinely interesting when someone forgot to be careful. She was in conversation with a man named Henry Crane, a barrister from London who was at the table in connection with a land matter Edmund was navigating, when she noticed the woman across from her. The woman was named Dorothea Langley. Clara had met her twice before, briefly, at county functions, and had filed her the way she filed most people she met twice briefly, noted, assessed, categorized for future reference. Dorothea Langley was beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, which was completely, and without apparent effort, the beauty distributed so evenly across her features that the effect was less of individual striking elements and more of a whole that was simply, objectively correct. She was also intelligent, which was more interesting than the beauty, and which Clara had noted the first time they met. What she had not noted the first time, because the circumstances had not provided the opportunity, was how Dorothea Langley looked at Edmund Ashford. She noticed it now. She noticed it with the same precise, undefended attention she gave to everything she was paying attention to, which meant she noticed it fully, and without the softening that self-interest sometimes provided. Dorothea Langley looked at Edmund the way a person looks at something they have made peace with not having. There was a quality in it that was not longing exactly, too composed for longing, but was the specific kind of stillness that follows longing when it has been carried for long enough to become a resting position. And Edmund, across the table, with his composed face and his correct attention distributed correctly around the room, had a particular quality of stillness when his gaze moved anywhere near Dorothea Langley's direction. Not looking, the opposite of looking, the deliberate non-looking of someone who knows that looking is dangerous. Clara noticed all of this in the space of a glance, and then returned to Henry Crane and the land matter, which was interesting in its own right, involving a boundary dispute that had several historical layers, and she let the conversation take her full attention for the rest of the dinner. After the guests had gone, much later, she and Edmund stood in the entrance hall in the quiet of the empty house. He was reviewing a note someone had left about the land matter. She was straightening the lily arrangement on the hall table, which had shifted slightly during the evening. "A productive evening," he said, without looking up. "Very," she said. "Henry Crane was useful." "Yes, you handled him well." He set down the note. He looked at her with the satisfaction of a man reviewing a completed thing. "You always do." She looked at the lilies, white, in the tall blue vase. She had chosen white because white held its shape in cold air and did not drop its petals during long evenings. She said, "I noticed something this evening." He waited. He was a man who waited well when waiting was required. "About Dorothea Langley," she said. He was very still for a moment, in the particular way that very still people are still when something has caught them. Then the stillness passed, and he said, with his usual composure, "What did you notice?" "The way she looks at you," Clara said, "and the way you don't look at her. A beat. A careful, measured beat." That is a long time ago, he said. I know, she said. I'm not raising it as an accusation. He looked at her. Then why are you raising it? She thought about this. She set the last lily straight and looked at the arrangement for a moment. Because I have been here for 15 months, she said, and I manage these evenings, and I notice the things in them that need noticing, and this is one of them, and I am noting it to you, because it seemed important to note. She paused, and because you have never noted anything of that kind to me. He was quiet. The clock in the hall marked the half hour. Outside, the wind moved through the trees at the end of the south lawn, with the sound it always made, the sound she had been listening to for 15 months. Clara, he said. I am not asking you to explain it, she said. I am not upset in the way you are perhaps expecting. I simply noticed it, and I am telling you. Because that is what honest people do when they notice things. They tell each other. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not composure, which was his default, and not discomfort, which sometimes replaced it, but something more complicated and less certain. The expression of a man who has been handed a mirror at an unexpected angle and is looking at an aspect of himself he had not been monitoring. You are right that I should have told you, he said. Yes, she said. It was not recent, he said. The situation you noticed. I know it was not recent. It is still something you carried into this marriage without mentioning it to me. He was quiet again. Then he said, very carefully, I thought it was not relevant. Because you had decided it was over. Yes. But it was relevant to me, she said, because I am the person you married instead, and knowing what I was instead of changes the picture somewhat. She looked at him steadily. I am not angry. I want to be clear about that. I am telling you this because I think it is the kind of thing we should have said to each other, and we did not say it, and I am wondering what else we have not said. He had no answer to this. She had not expected him to have one. It was not the kind of question that had an immediate answer. It was the kind that required sitting with. She said good night. She went upstairs. She went to the green wallpaper room and sat in the window seat in the dark for a long time and looked at the kitchen garden below, bare and cold in the November night. She was not, she realized, angry about Dorothea Langley. She did not know quite what she was about Dorothea Langley. Something, certainly, but it was complicated by the fact that Edmund had not lied about it, had simply not mentioned it, which was a different kind of thing, and required a different kind of response. What she was more immediately concerned about was the mirror she had handed him at an unexpected angle, and whether he would pick it up and look into it, or whether he would set it down and move on. She thought he would probably set it down and move on. He was a man who moved on efficiently. It was one of his qualities, but she was also not certain, which was more interesting than she expected. She opened the notebook. She wrote, I told him something true tonight, and I watched him receive it. He did not receive it badly. He received it the way he receives things that disturb his understanding of a situation, carefully, without denying it, putting it in the category of things to be examined later. Whether he examines it later is the question. I have been noting things for 15 months and putting them in this notebook, and I examine them constantly. I do not know what he does with the things he notices. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. In the morning things were exactly as they always were. He came to breakfast and said good morning, and poured his coffee, and picked up his correspondence. She poured her tea and ate her toast, and they discussed a practical matter about the estate accounts that required her attention. Everything was correct and orderly, and entirely as it should have been. She thought, this is the problem. Not that things are wrong. That things are always exactly as they should be, which means there is no room in them for anything that should not be, and therefore no room for anything real. She ate her toast and thought about mountains. The thought had started in February, on the morning she lay in the gray light looking at the ceiling, and understood what she needed to understand. It had returned intermittently since then, the thought of height, of somewhere you could stand and see from, somewhere the scale of things was honest and large enough to put your own life into accurate proportion. She had not yet told Nell about the thought. She had not yet told anyone, but it was becoming less a thought and more a direction, and she had learned enough about her own internal processes to know the difference between those two things. The dinner party in November was not the thing that made her decide. She had been deciding slowly since February, and the decision was almost complete before November. But the dinner party showed her something clearly that she had been not quite seeing for months, which was this. She had been managing these evenings for Edmund, and managing the house for Edmund, and learning this estate for Edmund, and all of it had been genuine, and all of it had mattered to her, and none of it had ever looked back. She had been paying attention to Hartwell for 15 months. Hartwell, which is to say Edmund, who was the embodiment of Hartwell in the way that people who have lived somewhere long enough become it, had been looking at something else. Not with malice. She believed this completely, not even with neglect, in the careless sense, simply with the specific blindness of someone who has decided they know what they have, and so has stopped looking at it. She thought about Captain the One-Eared Cat. He had started the winter regarding her with outright contempt. He had moved, by autumn, to a kind of grudging assessment, and then to cautious tolerance. And now, in November, on Sunday mornings, in the second drawing room, he occasionally sat on the windowsill next to her chair and allowed her to read in his vicinity. She had taken this progression seriously, and she had earned each stage of it by being consistently herself, not performing warmth she did not feel, not forcing contact, simply being there and being reliable about it. She had been hoping, she understood now, for something like that from Edmund. Not the same thing. She was not a cat, and he was not her, but the same quality of gradual recognition, the slow accumulation of what you actually were in someone's awareness, until the day they looked up and saw it. It was possible he was incapable of it. She did not know. It was possible it simply had not yet happened. She did not know that either. What she knew was that she was no longer willing to wait in the same arrangement, managing from behind the smooth surface, for a recognition that might not come. She needed to know if she could exist as herself, fully herself, messy and specific and attentive and opinionated and capable and difficult, and be worth something to someone. Not to a house or an estate or a position or a social arrangement. To a person. She needed to go somewhere where the conditions were right to find out. She needed height. She needed somewhere you could see from. She needed the cottage. She told Nell about it in the letter she wrote in the first week of March. The letter she drafted 3 times, and burned twice, and sent on the 3rd attempt. She told Nell she was not in crisis, but in the opposite of crisis, which she did not have a name for. She told her about the cottage and why she was going. She packed 1 bag. She wrote Edmund's letter. She set it on the hall table weighted down by the China Swan salt cellar. She went out in the dark at 5 in the morning, and did not look back. She had been honest about all of it. She believed that honesty was the thing Edmund had given her, and therefore the thing she owed him in return, which was also the most useful thing she could give him, though she suspected he would not see it that way immediately. She did not require him to see it that way immediately. She required him to receive it, which was different. Receiving a thing honestly meant sitting with it until you understood it, and understanding sometimes took time. She gave him time. She was in Cumbria, building fires and clearing bramble, and learning the fell and writing in her notebooks, and she was giving him time, and she was giving herself time, and time was what she had most of now, which was one of the things she had discovered she needed. The fell was teaching her things she had not known she needed to know. It was teaching her about scale, that a life that felt very large when you were inside it could look very small from a sufficient height, and that this was not a diminishment, but a clarification. It was teaching her about patience, in the form that only weather can teach it, the patience of accepting conditions you cannot change, and working within them, rather than against them. It was teaching her about physical reality, about what a person's body could do, when you asked it to do things that were genuinely demanding, which was considerably more than she had previously known. She was learning. She was always learning. This was, she understood now, her fundamental quality, not composure, not competence, not the absence of scenes, the willingness to pay full attention to whatever she was inside, and to keep paying it until she understood. She had been paying full attention to Hartwell for 15 months. Now she was paying it to herself, and what she was finding was someone she had not quite met before, someone who was more than what the smooth surface had been covering, and who needed different conditions to be visible. She was becoming visible, slowly, in the fell light, in the cold and the mud and the fire building and the bramble clearing and the long walks on the ridge path. She was becoming visible to herself. That was, she thought, sitting at the table in the cottage, on a clear April evening, with the fire going, and the notebook open, and the sound of the fell wind against the window, the thing she had actually needed all along. to be visible to herself first. Everything else could come after. She was in the garden on a Thursday afternoon in late April when she heard the footsteps on the track. She had learned to read the track by sound in the weeks since she arrived. She knew the sound of George Abbott's van in the lower section. She knew the sound of the postman's bicycle and the specific rattle it made when he came off the lane onto the loose stones of the track's beginning. She knew the sound of Archie Dean's wife, who had started walking this way in the mornings, and whose boots had a different weight and a different rhythm from anyone else's. These footsteps were none of those. They were the footsteps of someone who did not know the track, careful on the steep sections, uncertain on the loose stones, making the slight hesitation of a person who is paying more attention to their feet than they expected to need to when they set out. She recognized the sound because it had been her own sound, on her first week. She was on her knees, in the third raised bed, working a section of compacted soil with a fork, and she was at a difficult angle, on a resistant piece of ground, and she did not want to lose the line she had found through it. She kept working. The footsteps came up the track and around the bend, and she heard them stop at the garden gate. She finished the piece of ground she was working. She straightened. She turned. Edmund Ashford was standing at the gate. He was in his walking jacket, the heavy brown one, the estate one, the one he wore when he was going somewhere and not performing going somewhere, and his boots were solid and worn enough to tell her he had walked a long way in them and knew how to do it. He had come up the track from the village, and the track had been exactly what the track was, which was not considerate of city shoes or social expectations, and he showed it in a way he would not have shown it 6 months ago. Or perhaps it was that she was seeing him more clearly from this distance, which was one of the things distance did. He was not composed in the way he was usually composed. He was doing something that looked like composure from the outside but felt, from where she was standing, in the garden, with her fork in her hand and mud on her knees, more like a man who has traveled a long way and arrived somewhere he is not entirely certain of. She did not put down the fork. He looked at her. He looked at the garden. He looked at the cottage behind her, and the fell rising above it. Then he looked at her again, and this time the looking had something different in it from the looks she was used to from him, which were assessments. Was the thing correct? Was it functioning? Was it as expected? This was something else. She could not yet name it. "I should have written first," he said. "Yes," she said. "I tried several times. I know. I could feel the letters that didn't come." Something moved in his face. "You knew I would come." "I thought it was possible," she said. "I didn't know." He looked at the garden again, at the cleared beds and the seedlings showing in all 4 of them now, green and specific and real, at the corner where the bramble had been and was no longer, at the rusted fork she had left standing in the ground near the back wall, which she had decided was part of the garden's history now and should stay. "You did all of this," he said. "Yes." The corner. He was looking at where the bramble had been, at the cleared ground, at the new soil she had turned in after the clearing was done. How long did it take? She looked at him. He was looking at the work, at the specific evidence of what it had cost, the time and the effort and the difficulty, and he was asking because he wanted to know, not because it was the thing you said. "About 2 weeks," she said. "The roots went very deep." He nodded. "I imagine they did." The fell wind came over the stone wall and moved through her hair, which was in no particular order, because she had been working for 2 hours, and hair was not relevant to the kind of work she was doing. A curlew called somewhere above them, that sounded like a question, in a language she almost understood. "Why did you come?" she said. She was not being sharp about it. She genuinely wanted to know, because there were several reasons he might have come, and they were not all the same thing, and it mattered which one it was. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking. But what came out was not the measured thing. It came ahead of the measurement, which meant it was real. "There is a notebook," he said, "that was in the dressing table drawer." She went still. "I looked for it," he said, "after you left. I went to the dressing table because I don't know why I went there first. I can't explain it. The drawer was open and the notebook was not in it, and I stood there for a while. I don't know how long. And I understood that it had been there for months, and I had called it accounts when you said what it was, and I had never looked at it, and now it was gone, and I could not stop thinking about what was in it." She looked at the gate between them, the low stone wall. the garden she had made, the fell behind him, enormous and unhurried. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You look cold. I am going to make tea. You can come in or stay out here. Either is acceptable." She turned and walked to the cottage. She heard the gate open behind her. She heard his boots on the garden path, learning it as he walked, uncertain on the uneven stones. She put the kettle on. She set out 2 cups. She moved around the small kitchen with the ease of someone who knows every inch of it and needs no adjustment, and she let that ease be visible because this was her space, and she did not need to accommodate him in it. She turned with the cups and found him standing in the doorway of the cottage with the fell behind him and the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window and falling on the stone floor, and the table with its notebooks and seed packets and the draft of a letter to the Penrith seed merchant about the heritage bean variety. He was looking at the room, not assessing it, something different from assessing. She had seen this expression before, but not on him. She had seen it on Nell when she held Oliver. On the tenants, when they showed her something they had made or grown. On people who were looking at something real and knowing it was real. It was the expression of genuine attention. Attention that was receiving rather than evaluating. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She poured the tea. He took the cup in both hands, wrapping his palms around it, which she had never seen him do. He always held cups correctly, by the handle, with the composed elegance of a man who had been shown the correct way to do everything very early and had maintained it since. This was different. This was someone who was cold and holding the heat where he could find it. She sat across from him. The fire was going. The cottage held its warmth around them. "I went to the elder," he said eventually. She looked at him. "After you left, I walked out to the south lawn. Amos was there, working on the lower branches of the adjacent oak. He looked at me standing under the elder, and he said, 'She told me this one is 260 years old.'" Edmund was looking at his tea. "I did not know that." "No," she said. "I also did not know about Mrs. Burrows in the proper detail, about the wall dispute, about the blackbird in the hollow of the elder's lowest branch." He paused. "I went to the estate room and found the red folder. The seed order was there, as you said. I forwarded it to Mrs. Burrows." He looked up at her. "I did not know what half of the seeds were." "She will know," Clara said. "She did," he said. She was very helpful about explaining it. Something in his expression shifted, something like rueful recognition. "She knew you, Clara. I went to visit and she spoke of you the way people speak of someone they are genuinely fond of. She was not speaking of a duchess who had visited her correctly. She was speaking of someone she actually knew." Clara held her cup. The fire shifted. The fell wind came at the window. "All 23 families," he said. "I visited them all, in the 3 weeks after you left. They all knew you. Not as the household's manager, as Clara." He looked at her steadily. "None of them knew me that way. I have owned that estate for 12 years, and none of my tenants know me the way they know my wife of 15 months. You were not visiting them," she said. "No," he said. "I was not." "And now?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Now I am. I started with Mrs. Burrows, who I gathered was the most essential person to understand first, based on your note. She told me about her husband's back, which I had not known about, and have since arranged a proper physician for. She told me about the wall dispute, which I had not known about in detail but which, once she explained, seemed like something that had a solution if someone looked at it clearly." He paused. "She also asked about Captain." Clara looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her Captain was well. I had checked." He met her eyes. "He was on the second drawing room windowsill on Sunday morning, as your letter indicated." He regarded me with what I can only describe as thorough professional skepticism. She did not smile. Not yet. But something in her chest, that had been held carefully for a very long time, adjusted slightly. "What do you want, Edmund?" she said. Directly. Kindly, but directly. He looked at her for a long time. He was a man who measured words, but what came was not measured. What came had been sitting behind the measurement for a long time, and came out ahead of it. "I want to know what is in the notebook," he said. She looked at him. "That is not why you came all this way," she said. "No," he said. "But it is what I mean." A pause. "Everything else I prepared to say, I had 6 weeks to prepare it, on the train and the coach and the track. It all sounded correct when I prepared it, and wrong when I arrived. This is the only thing that still sounds right. I want to know what is in the notebook. I want to know what you have been noticing for 15 months that I was not noticing. I want to know what I walked past every day and did not look at. She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at him. The notebook, she said, is full of the specific things I noticed that no one was watching me noticed. The quality of light on the south lawn at 4 in the afternoon in November. What the root system of an established oak tells you about how much of a life happens underground where no one can see it. The history of the wall dispute between Mr. Finch and Mrs. Burroughs, which is not about the wall at all. The way Mrs. Pritchard's mood could be read entirely from the sounds in the kitchen without going in. Captain's progression from contempt to what might be called tolerance. The crack in the third pew at St. Giles, filled by someone who cared enough to fix it, but not enough to match the color. She paused. And what it felt like to notice all of those things, and bring them home in my hands every day, and have nowhere to put them, except the notebook. He was still. I am not accusing you, she said. I want to be clear about that. You did not take those things from me. You simply did not see them, and I did not know, when I agreed to the marriage, that not being seen was a kind of hunger, or that I had a particular need for it, that I had not previously encountered, because I had never lived so closely with someone who was not looking. I was not looking, he said. It was not a question. No, she said. You were approving, which felt like looking, until I understood the difference. He received this. She watched him receive it, not flinching, not defending, not moving toward the management of it. That was his usual response to discomfort. Simply receiving it, the way you receive information that is hard and accurate and necessary. I am not ready to come back, she said. I need you to hear that clearly. I hear it. I am still in the middle of something here, she said. I am becoming someone I did not know I was, and I am not going to leave that unfinished. And if I come back, when I come back, I am not coming back as the person you needed. I am coming back as whoever I actually am, which is more complicated and more specific and probably less convenient. I understand, he said. I need you to decide whether that is genuinely what you want, she said. Not because you feel guilty, not because I left and you felt the absence of something, because you have looked at who I actually am, and you want that. He held his cup. He looked at the fire. He was quiet for a long time in the way that was real quiet, not managed quiet. I do not know yet, he said, whether I know how to do what you are describing. I am trying to be honest with you. She looked at him. That, she said, is the most honest thing you have said to me in 15 months. Something in his face moved. He held it. It passed. Will you show me the fell? He said. She looked at the window. The afternoon light was at its best, the golden 20 minutes she had learned not to miss. Yes, she said. Put your cup down. They went out into the April afternoon. The fell rose above them, enormous and honest and entirely indifferent to their history or their future, which was exactly what she needed from it. She walked ahead, up the first rise, and she did not slow her pace for him, because this was her ground and her pace, and she had earned both, and she trusted him to keep up. He kept up. He was a man who walked well when walking was required, long-strided and steady, finding his footing on the uneven ground with the attention of someone who has stopped worrying about what the ground looks like and started paying attention to what it actually is. They reached the first ridge, and the view opened. The valley below, the fells beyond, the sky enormous and clear. She stopped and stood in it, and let the wind come off the high ground and bring her into herself, the way it always did up here. He stood beside her. He did not say anything for a long time. He looked at what was there, which was a great deal, and he was quiet with it, and she watched him be quiet with it and thought, he is doing something he does not do at Hartwell. He is doing what I have been doing every day since I arrived. He is just looking at what is here, without deciding what it should be. I understand, he said at last, why you needed this. She looked at him. Not all of it yet, he said. But this. He gestured, not at anything specific, at the whole thing, the fell and the sky and the scale of it. I can feel why this. I can feel what it does. It makes you the actual size of a person, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said, exactly that. They stood at the ridge for a while longer. and then came back down the track toward the cottage. And she walked ahead, and he followed, and the fell was around them, and the evening was coming in from the west, with the warm colors of a clear April sunset, amber and rose on the high ground. At the cottage gate he stopped. "I am staying at the Fell Arms," he said, "in the village. I will be there for the week, if you are willing." She looked at him. "A week," she said. "Or shorter, if you prefer. Or longer, if—" He stopped, started again. "I am asking for whatever you are willing to give. That is all." She opened the gate. She went into the garden. She stopped and turned. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said, "at 9. There is a section of the stone wall that has fallen inward and needs resetting. I will show you how dry stone walling works." He looked at her for a moment. At the garden she had made, and the cottage she had claimed, and the fell she had learned, and the woman she had become in all of it. "I will be here," he said. She went inside. She closed the door. She stood in the cottage for a moment and let the day settle around her. Then she put the kettle on. She opened the notebook. She wrote, "He came. He is at the Fell Arms. He asked to see the fell, and I showed it to him, and he was quiet with it in the right way. Tomorrow he is coming to learn dry stone walling. I do not know yet what any of this means. I am going to watch it and find out, which is what I always do, and what I am best at." She closed the notebook. She made supper. She went to bed early and lay in the dark listening to the fell wind and thought about what patience really was, which was not passivity. It was not waiting without understanding. It was doing the full work of attending while you waited. It was watching, clearly and completely, without deciding the outcome in advance. She was very good at that. She had always been very good at that. He was at the garden gate at 9 in the morning. Exactly. She noted this without surprise. Edmund Ashford was a man who arrived when he said he would arrive, which had always been true and was still true, and she filed it in the category of things about him that had not changed and probably would not, which was not a small category, and included many things she valued. He was wearing the heavy walking jacket again, and the boots that had been up the track twice now, and were beginning to understand what was required of them. He had a quality she had not seen at Hartwell, or had not noticed at Hartwell, or perhaps had not been able to see at Hartwell, because the surface of things there was so consistently managed that what lay beneath it was difficult to observe through it. Here, on her ground, with the smooth surface of his own life removed by several hundred miles, she could see him more clearly. What she saw was a man who was paying attention, not the distributed, correct attention of a man managing his circumstances, the attention he had given to their dinners, to the estate, to the letters and the accounts, and the decisions that arrived on his desk in stacks, and required regular processing. This was different. This was the focused, slightly uncertain attention of someone who has arrived somewhere they do not know, and is trying to understand it before they make a move. She appreciated this. She led him to the section of the wall that had fallen inward. "Dry stone walling," she said, "does not work by cutting the stone to fit the space. It works by learning the space well enough to find the stone that already fits it." She held up a piece of the gray Lakeland limestone. "You look for how the pieces fit each other, not how to make them fit. The wall already knows what it wants to be. The person building it is just helping it get there." He looked at the fallen section. He looked at the stones she had laid out on the ground beside it. "And how do you know which stone fits which space?" "You pick it up and try it," she said. "You try a lot of stones that don't fit before you find the one that does. That is how it works." He looked at her with the expression she was coming to recognize as the expression he wore when something she said had landed differently from how he expected. "Right," he said. He picked up a stone. He looked at the gap in the wall. He tried the stone. It did not fit. He set it down and picked up another. She left him to it. She went to the fourth bed, which needed turning, and she turned it. 30 yards away she could hear him working, the sound of stones being lifted and set, the occasional thoughtful silence of someone assessing. He was slow, and she could hear it in the rhythm of the work, but he was patient with his own slowness, which was something she had not known about him. He had not, at any point, become frustrated with his own mistakes. He had simply tried again. After an hour she went to look. He had reset 5 stones in the fallen section. They were correct, not refined, not the work of someone who had spent years doing this. but correct in the essential way. The stones seated and stable and holding each other. The gap was closed for that section. She looked at it. "That's good," she said. He looked at what he had done. It took considerably longer than it should have. "It always does," she said. "Until it doesn't. And then you've learned it, and you can't unlearn it." He looked at her. "Is that meant to be a broader point?" "No," she said. "I am talking about dry stone walling." He almost smiled. She caught it at the edge of his expression, the almost smile of a man who is not used to being caught slightly off balance, and is deciding whether he minds. She went back to her bed. He went back to the wall. At midday she made sandwiches, cheese and chutney, on the bread she bought from Archie Dean's shop each morning. She brought them out to the garden, and they ate sitting on the low wall on the sunny side, out of the fell wind. He ate with the comfortable directness of someone who is hungry and does not feel the need to discuss the food at the level of appreciation. "Tell me about the families," he said. She looked at him. "The tenants," he said. "You knew them all. 23 families. I would like to know them the way you knew them, and I don't yet, and I am asking you to tell me." She looked out at the garden for a moment, at the seedlings in their beds, at the corner where the bramble had been, at the rusted fork standing in its position near the back wall. Then she began. She told him about the Burrows family in the North Cottage and what Mrs. Burrows had built there, not only the kitchen garden, but the entire management of a household with a husband who had been limited for months, and she told him the story of it in the detail it deserved. She told him about the Finches and Captain and the wall dispute and the documentary history she had reconstructed, and what she thought the resolution might be if someone with authority over the estate documents took it seriously. He listened. He asked questions, specific ones, the kind that showed he was following the detail and not just the general shape. He asked about the Burrows' children's ages and what the physician she had recommended had said about the husband's back, and she told him what she knew. He asked about the 1887 boundary maps and whether she thought the county archive would have them, and she told him she was nearly certain they would. "I'll look into it," he said, "when I go back." "Mrs. Burrows would appreciate knowing someone is looking into it," she said. "Not just that it might be looked into." He held this. "I understand the difference," he said. "Good," she said. She told him about more of the families through the afternoon. Not all of them. There were 23, and an afternoon was not long enough for 23 families in the detail they deserved, but enough for him to begin to have the picture, the actual picture, the one you could not get from estate accounts or rent records or even formal visits where people were polite and gave you what they thought you needed. He took it in with the same patient, slightly uncertain attention he had been giving to everything since he arrived, and she found herself thinking something she had not expected to think, which was, he is trying, not performing trying, actually trying, in the way that trying looks when it is real, which is clumsy and slow and without elegance. She did not say this. She told him about Mr. Finch and Captain, and about the documentary history of the wall, and he listened with his eyes on the garden and his hands around his second cup of tea, and the afternoon light moved across the fell behind the cottage wall, and the wind was easier than it had been, and the sky was the specific blue of a clear April afternoon at altitude, which was a color she had been trying to name for weeks, and had not yet found the right word for. "I have a question," he said, when she reached the end of what she was telling him about the Finch family. "Yes," she said. "What did you write in the notebook?" he said. "About me." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden, not at her, which she thought was either sensitivity or difficulty, and she could not tell yet which. "Nothing," she said. He looked at her. "Nothing?" "I did not write about you in the notebook," she said. "I wrote about the house and the land and the people. I wrote about what I noticed and what I thought and what I found. I did not write about you." He was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" She considered this honestly. "Because you were not in the category of things I was noticing," she said. "You were the condition of the noticing. You were the house I was inside while I was looking out the windows." He sat with this for a long time. The wind moved through the garden. A sheep somewhere on the upper fell called once and was answered by another. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time," he said. "Yes," she said. It probably did not feel good. No, he said. It did not. He came back the next morning at 9, and the morning after that. He was learning the wall. He had taken to spending an hour on it each morning, before she set him to other things, and his pace was improving without him commenting on it, which she noted. He was also learning the track, which was not something you could rush, but which yielded to daily repetition, and by the third day, he was walking it the way she walked it, with the automatic, unthinking confidence of someone whose feet had made the path their own. On the fourth day, she took him up the fell to the ridge. She had been waiting for a clear morning, which she did not always get in April, but Thursday was clear and bright, and the wind was manageable, and she judged it was time. They walked up the track from the cottage and onto the fell path she had been using since her first week, and she set the pace, and he kept it without comment, and the fell opened around them the way it always did, enormously, honestly, without apology for its own scale. At the first ridge they stopped, and she showed him what there was to see, which was everything. The valley below with Brackenmore, a small clear arrangement of buildings at its center. The fells beyond, going fold on fold to the horizon. The sky bigger than any sky she had seen before coming here, the full dome of it visible from this height, in a way it never was below. He stood beside her and did not say anything. She watched him not saying anything, and she watched what was happening in him while he was not saying it, which was the thing that mattered. He was receiving it, the scale of it, the honesty of it, the way it made everything else, the estate, the dinners, the social machinery, the position and the history and the name, proportionate in a way that was accurate rather than diminishing. She makes you the actual size of a person, he said at last. He was looking at the horizon. Yes, she said, that is what it does. I have not been the actual size of a person in a very long time, he said. I am not certain I know what that feels like. She looked at him. He was still looking at the horizon, and his face was the most open she had ever seen it. Not unguarded in the way of someone who has lost their guard, but open in the way of someone who has set it down deliberately, because they have found somewhere safe enough to set it. You look like you feel it now, she said. He glanced at her. The almost smile again, but closer to a real one this time. Yes, he said. I think I do. They walked back down to the cottage. At the gate he stopped, as he had stopped each evening. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask, she said. The notebook, he said. When you said you had things to say, that you had nowhere to put, would you show me? Not have me read it. Show me, tell me what is in it. I want to hear it the way I should have been hearing it, from you, in your own words, with the full weight of what it means. She looked at him for a long moment. Not today, she said, perhaps tomorrow. He nodded. He accepted this without pushing at it, which was also something new, and she noted it. He came at 9 the next morning, Friday. She had built the fire and made tea, and sat at the table and waited, and when she heard his footsteps on the track, she opened the notebook to the first page. She read to him for 2 hours. Everything. From the first entry about the crack in the third pew at St. Giles, to the last thing she had written before he arrived, which was about the quality of light on the fell on a Tuesday morning, and what it meant to be somewhere that did not require you to be anything except present. He sat across the table from her and listened with the full, specific attention she had watched him give to things that mattered to him. He was giving it to her now, not to the evidence of her management or the evidence of her correctness, to her, to what she had been seeing and thinking and feeling for 15 months, while she was inside the condition of his life. When she closed the notebook, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I married you because you were plain. She looked at him. That was the word in my head, he said, when I decided. Not beautiful, not complicated, not difficult, plain. And I meant it as a virtue. I meant it as, she will be here. She will be reliable. She will make my life more livable, without making it harder. And I thought I was being honest about that. And I thought honest was enough. He paused. What I did not understand was that plain was the wrong word entirely. Plain means without decoration. What you are is without performance. And I received those two things as the same, and they are not the same. And the gap between them is the size of everything in that notebook. She held the closed notebook in her hands. The fire was burning steadily. The fell wind was at the window. Yes, she said. That is exactly it. He looked at her steadily. I am sorry, he said. I am not saying it because I feel I should say it. I am saying it because I understand, now, what it cost you, and I am sorry for that cost. She held this. She let it be there without rushing to do anything with it. I know, she said. I believe you. She looked at the window. The fell was very clear in the Friday morning light. Come back next week, she said. I am going to think over the weekend. I will tell you on Monday what I have decided. He nodded. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door he stopped. The notebook, he said. The things in it. I am going to remember them, not as information, as... He stopped, started again. As what they are. What are they? She said. He looked at her. Evidence, he said, of a person I should have been paying attention to. She held his gaze. Go on then, she said. I will see you Monday. He went out. She heard his footsteps on the garden path and then on the track, steady and sure-footed now, someone who had learned the ground. She sat at the table for a long time. The fire burned. The notebook was closed in her hands. She opened it to the last page and she wrote, He listened to all of it. He said the right thing, and he said it because he meant it, and not because he thought it was required. I am going to spend the weekend finding out what I think about that. She closed the notebook. She looked at the garden through the window. She thought, I will know on Monday. I always know when I know. She would know on Monday. The weekend was clear and cold, and she spent most of it outdoors, because outdoors was where she thought best, and what she needed was to think. She walked on Saturday, up the fell path to the ridge, and then along the ridge path to the east, further than she usually went, into the high ground she had not yet learned properly. She went carefully, watching the ground and the sky, and the way the path behaved as it got higher, and she found new things. A stretch of limestone pavement, flat and cracked and ancient, where the rock was exposed and the turf had given way to it. A tarn, a small, still mountain lake, set in a hollow between two ridges with the color of pewter in the afternoon light. A section of ridge where the wind came from two directions at once, and created a turbulence that was not dangerous, but was interesting. The air itself, in argument with itself. She stood at the tarn for a long time. The water was very still. In it she could see the sky reflected, and the reflection of the fell above, and a faint edge of herself at the near bank, a pale shape in the dark water. She thought about Edmund. She allowed herself to think about him clearly and fully for the first time since he had come. Not the managed version of the thinking, not the version she monitored for bias or self-interest, but the actual thinking, the kind she did when she was alone on the fell with no one to perform it for. He had come. He had not written, which was interesting. He had said he had tried to write, which she believed, and had not been able to, which she also believed, because the writing required finding words for a thing he did not yet have the words for, and Edmund was someone who did not begin things until he had the language ready. Coming was different. Coming was going somewhere in the absence of language, and trusting that the language would arrive when he got there. She had not expected that from him. He had been at the wall for 5 mornings. She had watched him learn it. He was not naturally skilled at it. He was trained for a kind of intelligence that was verbal and strategic, and excellent for managing complex, interconnected problems across long periods of time, not for the immediate physical intelligence of finding the stone that fit the space. But he had patience with his own learning, which she had not known about him. He had not, at any point, become frustrated with his own mistakes. He had simply tried again. She had told him about the tenants for an entire afternoon, and he had listened and asked questions and taken it in, and she had watched him take it in, and had seen, clearly and without hope distorting the observation, that he was receiving it not as information about the correct management of the estate, but as information about people. She had seen him make the transition, the specific moment in the conversation about Mrs. Burrows, when his questions shifted from logistical to personal, when he asked about the children not as factors in the management of the situation, but because he wanted to know about them. She had read him the notebook. All of it, 2 hours of it, every entry from the crack in the third pew to the last thing she had written before he came. He had listened with the full attention he gave to things that mattered to him, and she had watched that attention shift over the course of the reading, begin as the careful attention of a man receiving important information about his own mistakes, and become something else by the end. something more like the attention she had described in the notebook itself, the attention that makes things real. At the end he had said, "I married you because you were plain." And then, plain was the wrong word entirely. She had known, as she heard it, that he was right. She had also known, as she heard it, that knowing the right word and being the person who paid the right kind of attention were not the same thing, and that the first was a beginning and not a guarantee of the second. She looked at her reflection in the tarn, the pale shape at the edge of the water, in her fell clothes, with her hair in no particular arrangement. She thought, "That is me. That is what I actually look like when there is no performance required, when the conditions allow it." She thought about what returning to Hartwell would mean. Not in the abstract. She had thought about it in the abstract many times, but specifically, concretely, in the way she thought about things when she needed to decide them. Returning to Hartwell would mean returning to the house she had learned, and the land she had loved, and the 23 families she knew, and the oak trees she had named in her head, and the kitchen garden, and Mrs. Dowell, and Amos, and Captain. It would mean returning to all of that, which she had genuinely loved, and genuinely wanted to be part of. It would also mean returning to a marriage, to a particular person, to someone who had looked at her for 15 months without seeing her, and who had spent a week on the fell learning dry stone walling and listening to what was in her notebook, and who had said, "I married you because you were plain," and then, plain was the wrong word. The question was not whether she believed him. She believed he meant what he said. The question was whether meaning what you said was the same as having changed what you saw, whether a man who had spent 40 years looking at one thing could learn, in a week on the fell, to look at something else. She did not know. She was honest about this. She did not know. What she did know was this: she was not the same person she had been when she left Hartwell. She had spent 2 months on the fell becoming someone who knew what she was for, who knew her own intelligence and her own capacity and her own need, the way you know a tool when you understand what it is actually for. That knowledge was hers. It did not require his recognition to be real. She carried it whether he saw it or not. But she also knew that she was not, at bottom, someone who wanted to be invisible. She was not someone who could sustain the kind of sufficiency she had found on the fell in complete isolation from the social world she had come from. She needed people, specific people, in the real way of a person who pays close attention to other people and therefore forms real attachments to them. She needed Mrs. Burroughs and the Finch family and Amos and the elder and the 20 families she had not yet visited this spring. She needed Hartwell, specifically, in the way you need places you have learned by heart. And she admitted, watching her reflection in the tarn, someone to come home to. Someone who would be there in the evenings and say things about their day and listen to things about hers. Not because she could not function alone, she had discovered definitively that she could, but because she was not, at her deepest level, designed for solitude. She was designed for connection. The same attention that made her extraordinary, alone, made her need someone to direct it toward. She looked at the tarn. She looked at the sky reflected in it. She looked at the fell above. She thought, the question is not whether I want to go back. I want to go back. The question is whether what I go back to can be different enough from what I left to make going back worth the risk. And the only way to know that was to go and find out. But she would not go as she had left, in the management mode, in the smooth surface mode, in the mode that made her invisible. She would go as herself, fully herself. Notebook and all, garden mud on her boots, opinions about oak trees and specific knowledge of 23 tenant families, and the capacity to notice things that no one else was noticing, and to say so clearly. She would go like that, and she would see what he did with it. On Sunday she stayed closer to home. She worked in the garden in the morning, and she rode in the afternoon, and she read in the evening, her grandmother's walking guides about the high fell paths she had not yet found. And she went to bed early, and lay in the dark, listening to the fell wind, and was, as she had often been in the last 2 months, content, in a way that was new to her, not the managed contentment of things being in order, but the real contentment of being where you were supposed to be. She was also, she noticed, not as frightened as she would have expected. She had expected to feel frightened about going back, if she decided to go back, frightened in the way that the prospect of returning to something difficult usually felt, the tightening, the bracing, the preparation of the self for effort. Instead, what she felt was a kind of steady readiness, like a door that has been closed and is simply waiting for the right moment to open. She slept well. She woke early. She built the fire on the first attempt and made tea and sat at the table in the morning light and looked at the garden through the kitchen window, at the seedlings in their beds and the repaired wall section and the cleared corner and all the evidence of the 2 months of real work she had done here. She thought, I know what I am going to say. I have known it since the tarn. At 9 o'clock, she heard his footsteps on the track, steady now, entirely sure of the ground. She opened the door before he reached the gate. He stopped when he saw her in the doorway. Come in, she said. I have made tea. He came in and sat down and took his cup in both hands, as he had done since the first day, and she sat across from him and looked at him in the morning light. I have thought about it, she said. Yes, he said. I am going to come back, she said. Not immediately. I have things I need to finish here first. The garden is not at the point where I can leave it, and I want to walk the East Ridge properly, and I promised Margaret Fell I would help with the village hall roof assessment, which is in 3 weeks. She looked at him. But I am going to come back. He held his cup. He was very still in the way. That was his real still, not the managed one. Under what conditions? He said. She had thought about this carefully, and she had her answer ready, which was not a list of requirements and was not an ultimatum, because she was not someone who dealt in those. It was simply what was true. I come back as myself, she said. Entirely. Notebook and all. I go on visiting the tenants, and writing and walking and noticing things, and those are not the background of my life at Hartwell. They are the life. And you, she met his eyes. You look. Properly. Not approval. Not management. The thing you were doing with the wall and the fell and the notebook. That kind of looking. At me, at the tenants, at what Hartwell actually is when someone pays it the right kind of attention. He listened to all of this. And if I don't, he said, if I find I can't sustain it, if I fall back into what I was, then I will tell you, she said. Clearly, not in a letter this time, to your face, at the breakfast table, in the way you prefer, which is directly. She paused. And you will listen, because that is what we are agreeing to. Not a guarantee of success, an agreement to be honest about what is happening as it happens. He looked at her for a long time. I can do that, he said. I believe you, she said. I think you can. I am not certain you will find it easy. No, he said. I don't expect it will be easy. Good, she said. Easy is what we had before. Easy is what the smooth surface is for. We are not doing that anymore. He looked at the fire. He looked at the garden. He looked at the notebooks on the table between them. He looked at her. When can I help with the village hall roof? He said. She looked at him. She was not expecting that. He was not expecting himself to say it, she could tell, which was the part she found most interesting. That the thing that came out of him in the space between prepared and unprepared was not the right social gesture, but the practical one. The assessment is in 3 weeks, she said. Margaret Fell is organizing it. There will be people from the village doing most of the work. Then I would like to be one of the people from the village doing most of the work, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man, this particular man, who had come up a fell track in the wrong boots, and learned to set dry stone, and listened to 2 hours of her notebook, and was now asking to help assess a village hall roof. I'll tell Margaret Fell, she said. He nodded. He drank his tea. Tell me about the East Ridge, he said. You mentioned you haven't walked it properly. She told him about the East Ridge. She told him about the limestone pavement and the tarn she had found on Saturday and the wind that came from 2 directions at once on the high section. He listened with the full attention he had been giving everything since he came, and then he said, I would like to walk it with you before you decide you are finished with it. She looked at him. Next Friday, she said, if the weather holds. The weather will hold, he said. I checked. She raised an eyebrow slightly. You asked someone about the Cumbrian weather forecast. I asked Daniel, he said, the coachman. He says Friday will be good. He knows this fell better than the weather service. She looked at him, at this man who had called the coachman by name. Friday, she said, 9 o'clock. I will be here, he said. The walk on Friday was long. and they were both prepared for it. She had packed provisions, bread and hard cheese and an apple each and a flask of strong tea, because a walk to the East Ridge and back properly was 5 hours, if you did it in the full way, which she intended to do, and she had learned on the fell that going without food on a long walk was the kind of economy that cost more than it saved. He arrived at 9, with his boots well worn in now, and a pack of his own, which she noted. He had been staying at the Fell Arms for nearly 2 weeks. He had stopped looking like a man who had arrived somewhere unexpected, and had started looking like a man who was somewhere he was choosing to be, which was a different quality entirely. They walked up the track to the fell path and turned east along the ridge. She set the pace, and he kept it without comment. The fell was in the full brightness of a clear May morning, which was different from April brightness, more certain, the sky a deeper blue, the green of the new growth on the lower slopes so vivid it seemed slightly unreal, the way new growth in high places always seems slightly unreal, to people who had been watching the brown of the winter fell for months. She told him what she was seeing as they walked, not performing the telling. She was not narrating for his benefit, providing a guided tour. She was simply doing what she did when she was on the fell, which was notice things, and think about them, and sometimes say them. And this time the person walking beside her was someone who was listening, which made the saying of them different. "The limestone pavement is in the next section," she said, as they reached the upper slope, after that bend. "It's interesting. The stone is Carboniferous limestone, which means it was formed at the bottom of a tropical sea, approximately 350 million years ago. The clints and grikes, the flat sections and the cracks between them, are made by rainwater dissolving the calcium carbonate in the rock over thousands of years. Each crack in that pavement is a record of several thousand years of rain." He looked at her. "How do you know about Carboniferous limestone?" "Books," she said. "My grandmother had 3 volumes of fell geology. I found them on the shelf in the second week." "Of course she did," he said. They reached the limestone pavement, and she showed him how to walk on it, not on the flat sections, where the surfaces could be slippery with the thin films of moisture that colonized them even on dry days, but on the edges of the grikes, where the footing was more reliable, and you could also look down into the cracks and see the ferns and mosses that colonized them, small green worlds in the miniature climate of the cracks. He crouched beside a grike and looked into it. She stood beside him. At the bottom, in the few inches of damp shadow, a fern was uncurling its new frond with the patient, specific determination of something that has been doing this for 350 million years, and intends to keep doing it. "Each one of these plants," she said, "is living in a climate that is significantly different from what is happening 2 inches above the crack. The grike catches water and holds it, and the walls block the wind, and the temperature is more stable than the open limestone. So the fern is living in a microclimate that happens to be exactly what it needs, in a crack made by thousands of years of rain, in stone from the bottom of a tropical sea." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fern. "You know," he said, "I have not thought about anything like this in a very long time." "Like what?" "Like the fact that we are standing on the floor of an ancient sea," he said. "That the ground under us was somewhere else entirely, once. That the world has been several different kinds of world before it became this one." "It is a useful thing to think about," she said. "Yes," he said, "it makes the estate seem less important." "Not less important," she said, "more accurately important. It is important, but it is a certain size, and the sea is a different size." He looked up at her from where he was crouching. "I think this is what you meant," he said, "about the fell making you the actual size of a person." "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what I meant." They walked on to the tarn. She had been looking forward to showing it to him, and when it came into view around the shoulder of the ridge she watched his face, and she saw him see it, the small, still lake in its hollow with the fells around it, and the sky reflected in it, and the absolute silence of a high place in the middle of a clear day. He stopped walking. He stood at the edge of the tarn and was quiet. She sat down on a stone at the near bank and opened the flask and poured tea into the cups she had brought, and she set his cup beside her and was quiet too, and they sat at the edge of the tarn for a long while without saying anything. The water was perfectly still, the reflection was perfect, fells, sky, the small dark shapes of 2 people at the edge. She looked at the reflection, and then at what it was reflecting, and thought about what it meant to see the same thing from two angles, which was what the last 2 months had been, in a way. The same life, seen from a different angle. The same person, seen from a height that made her the actual size. "I would like to tell you something," Edmund said. She looked at him. "About Dorothea Langley," he said. "Since we have begun being honest about these things." She waited. "It was before I met you," he said. "Several years before. I had believed, for approximately 2 years, that we would be married. She had given me reason to believe it. And then she did not, and the reason she gave was that I was," she said, "unable to see her. She said I looked at her and saw what I expected her to be, rather than what she was." He was looking at the water. "I thought at the time that she was wrong," he said. "I thought I had been attentive and correct, and that she had wanted something I was not able to give, and had invented a reason for it. I was very certain she was wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not certain she was wrong," he said. Clara looked at him. At his face, in the clear fell light, open in the way it had been getting more open each day. The composure not gone, but not covering everything it used to cover. "No," she said. "I don't think she was wrong." "No," he said. "I think she was saying the same thing you were saying in your letter, and I did not hear it from her, and I did not hear it from you for 15 months, and then you left, and I had to go and stand under the elder, and find out from Amos that I did not know how old she was." He looked at the tarn. "I am not telling you this because I think it excuses anything," he said. "I am telling you because you deserve to have the complete picture, and I should have given you more of it before, but I did not have the language for it, and I hope, I am beginning to have the language." She looked at the tarn, at the reflection of the sky in the still water, at the small exact shapes of themselves at the water's edge. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He nodded. He picked up his tea. They ate their provisions at the edge of the tarn, and then walked back along the ridge and down the fell path to the cottage. And they did not talk much on the way back, but the silence was the kind that had something in it. Not the silence of two people who have nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have said enough for now and are letting it settle. At the cottage gate she stopped and turned to him. "I am going to come back in 3 weeks," she said, "after the village hall roof assessment. I will drive back with you if you are staying, or I will take the train if you need to return before then." "I will stay," he said. "Then we drive back together," she said. He nodded. He looked at the gate, at the garden, at the cottage. He looked at her. "I would like to come back," he said, "to this place, when it is possible." "You can come back whenever you like," she said. "It is a place that rewards returning to." She paused. "Most things do." He looked at her for a moment. "Is that meant to be a broader point?" "No," she said. "I am talking about the fell." The almost smile again, closer to real each time. "Right," he said. She opened the gate. She went into the garden. She stopped and looked back at him over the wall. "Edmund," she said. He was looking at her. "The peregrines," she said. "You told me they nest on the north crags. I have not found them yet. I have been looking." "The north face of Brant Ridge," he said. "There is a section of vertical limestone face, about 200 feet up. They have nested there for at least 30 years, possibly longer. My father knew about them." He paused. "I haven't thought about them in years. I am going to find them," she said. "I know," he said. "You will tell me when you do." "Yes," she said. "I will tell you when I do." She went inside. She closed the door. She stood in the warm cottage for a moment, with the fire going, and the notebooks on the table, and the garden visible through the kitchen window. She picked up the newest notebook and opened it to a fresh page and wrote, "He told me about Dorothea Langley. He told me because he thought I deserved the complete picture, which means he is thinking about what I deserve, which is new. He also remembered his father's peregrines. He has things in him that he does not look at. We have that in common, possibly. The East Ridge walk was very good. The tarn was exactly right. The fell is doing what the fell does, which is make everything accurately sized." She closed the notebook. She made supper. She went to bed. The fell wind was at the window with its usual honest volume, and she listened to it and thought about peregrines on north-facing limestone, and about 3 weeks, and about a drive back across England with a man who was learning, slowly and genuinely, to look. She was going to find the Peregrines before she left. She decided this clearly, in the dark, listening to the wind. In the morning, she would start with the north face of Brant Ridge. The village hall roof assessment was on a Thursday in the following week. Margaret Fell had organized it with the efficiency of a woman who has organized things in a small community for 30 years and has learned that the most effective approach is to assign specific tasks to specific people and not to provide too much opportunity for collective discussion, which tends toward the theoretical rather than the practical. Clara was on the inside inspection team, which she had volunteered for because she was curious about the structure of old English village halls and had never had occasion to examine one from the inside. Edmund was on the external team with George Abbott and two men from the village named Walter and Pete, who had done most of the original building work on the hall 30 years ago and regarded its roof as a matter of personal significance. She spent 2 hours in the roof space with Francis, the village hall committee treasurer, who had the organized mind of someone who deals professionally with other people's money and has concluded that the world would function better if everyone made lists. They assessed the insulation and the rafter condition and the state of the roof from below, and Francis made notes in a very organized notebook, and Clara made notes in her own rather more fluid way, and they compared notes at the end and found that they had reached the same conclusions by different routes, which Clara found satisfying. Outside, Edmund had been on the roof itself, with George and Walter and Pete. She found them all on the ground afterward, looking up at the hall from the outside, with the evaluating expressions of people who have looked at a thing closely and have opinions about what they found. "South-facing slope is fine," George said. "Another 15 years in those slates. The north-facing slope is another story." He looked at Edmund. "You want to tell her, or shall I?" "Several sections of the north slope are going to need replacing, within 2 years," Edmund said to Clara. "The slates are good, but the underfelt beneath them has deteriorated and is not doing its job." "Walter thinks 2 years is optimistic." "Walter would know," she said. She looked at Walter. Walter, who was 70, and had the weathered face of someone who has spent decades dealing with the outside of buildings in fell weather, nodded in the manner of a man who does not waste words when a nod will serve. 18 months, he said. 18 months, Edmund agreed. He looked at Clara. "I told Margaret I would be glad to contribute to the repair cost, if the committee would find it useful. She said she would discuss it with the committee." Clara looked at him. He had said this casually, as one reports a practical thing that has been arranged. He had not said it in the way of a man making a donation, for which he expected acknowledgement. "That was kind," she said. "It is a useful building," he said. "It should have a sound roof." Walter looked at Edmund, then he looked at Clara, then he looked at his boots for a moment, in the way of someone who has just formed an opinion and is deciding whether to express it. "He's all right," Walter said, to Clara, not to Edmund. "Yes," she said, "he is." Edmund, to his credit, did not respond to this at all. He simply looked at the roof again, with the evaluating expression of a man who is thinking about the practical problem, rather than anything anyone has just said about him. They walked up the fell in the evening of that Thursday, not the long ridge walk but the shorter route, to the first rise that she had been doing since the beginning, the familiar one, the one she knew the way she knew the cottage and the garden. She had walked this route in all weathers and all times of day, and she knew what it felt like at every point, the specific ground beneath her feet, the particular way the wind moved through the section below the granite outcrop. He walked beside her now, with the ease of someone who had learned the ground, and she let herself notice this, let it be a real thing she was feeling, rather than an observation she was cataloging, which was its own kind of learning. "I want to ask you something," she said when they were at the rise. "Yes," he said. "When you went to the elder after I left," she said, "what were you thinking? What were you actually thinking?" He was quiet for a moment. The valley was below them in the evening light, very clear. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that I had been wrong about a word. I had used the word plain to mean something I thought was positive, and it had meant something else to you, and I understood, standing under that tree, that I had been wrong about the word. But I also understood something more uncomfortable, which was that the word I had used was not the real issue. The real issue was what was behind the word, That I had looked at you and decided what you were and stopped looking. That I had categorized you, accurately in some ways, and then treated the category as the same as the person. He paused. The elder made that very clear, he said. Because Amos told me she was 260 years old and I had not known that, and I had walked past her every day for 12 years, and I understood that what I had been doing, walking past her without really looking, was the same thing I had been doing with you. Not from malice, from habit. From the habit of thinking I already knew what I was looking at. Clara looked at the valley below. The elder has been there for 260 years, she said. She was a landmark before the house existed. She watched your family build the house and live in it for 4 generations. She knows things about that estate that no document records. She paused. What do you think she knows about you? He looked at the valley. That I am here, he said, and that I have been here for a long time, and that I have not always looked at what was around me. He turned and looked at her, and that I am trying to change that. She looked back at him. She is patient, she said. Oaks generally are. I gathered, he said. They walked back down as the evening came in from the west, the last light on the high ground making the fells look like something that had been painted very carefully by someone who understood that the color of evening on limestone was almost impossible to replicate, but was worth attempting. At the cottage gate he stopped, as he always stopped. Tomorrow morning, she said. 6:30. Peregrines. 6:30, he said. She went inside. She wrote in the notebook for an hour, about the village hall and Walter, and what Edmund had said at the first rise about the elder, and what it meant to be wrong about a word, and know you are wrong about a word. She wrote about the Peregrines, and what it felt like to watch them in the early morning, on the limestone face. She wrote about the drive back to Hartwell that was now a week away, and what she was carrying with her from the fell, which was considerable. She wrote at the end, I am not frightened. I thought I would be. Approaching the return. I am not. I am. The word I have been looking for is ready. Not in the sense of having resolved everything, or being certain of the outcome. In the sense of having done the work, and being what I am, and going forward as that. Ready in the way of the seeds before they germinate. Everything in place, the conditions met. The rest a matter of time and attention. She closed the notebook. She looked at the garden in the dark. Then she went to bed and slept. She found the Peregrines on the Wednesday of the 3rd week, in the early morning when the light was still low and direct, and the limestone face of Brant Ridge was lit from the east, in a way that threw every irregularity into sharp relief. She had been out since 6:30, earlier than usual, because the book she had found in the fell geology section had mentioned that peregrines were most active in the first 2 hours of daylight, particularly in the breeding season. She had brought the old binoculars from her grandmother's kitchen drawer. They were heavy, and the focus wheel was slightly stiff, but they were good glass, the kind that lasted when it was made properly, and she had been carrying them on the ridge walks for a week in anticipation of this. She saw the female first. She was on a ledge approximately 2/3 of the way up the limestone face, and she was very still in the way that resting birds of prey were still, which was a different stillness from anything else, total and efficient, conserving every small calorie against the cold of the early morning. Clara stood very still herself and watched through the binoculars. After perhaps 3 minutes, the female shifted, turned her head, and from somewhere above and to the left came the male, arriving with the particular speed of a falcon at low velocity, unhurried, but with the absolute certainty of something that knows it could be going much faster, and is choosing not to for now. He landed on the ledge beside her, and they sat together in the early light, and were not looking at anything particular, just resting in the way of creatures that have done what they needed to do for the morning, and are taking the time between things. Clara watched them for 20 minutes, then she put the binoculars in her pocket, and walked back down to the cottage. Edmund arrived at 9. She was in the garden. The north face of Brant Ridge, she said when he came through the gate. Early morning. The pair were on the ledge at about 2/3 height. The male came in from above and to the left. He stopped. He looked at her. You found them, he said. Yes, she said, as promised. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had been watching develop over 3 weeks. The open one. The one that was not composure, but something more like presence. Tell me, he said. She told him. She described the female on the ledge, and the way the early light had caught the limestone, and the quality of the male's arrival, and how long she had watched them, and what they had done. He listened with the attention that had become his default on the fell, and she watched him listen and thought, he is going to remember this. He is filing it in the place where real things go. I would like to see them, he said. Tomorrow morning, she said, 6:30. Bring the binoculars from the fell arms if they have any. They have a pair, he said. I noticed them on the hallway shelf. I'll ask Margaret about them. She looked at him. Margaret. 3 weeks ago he would have said the woman at the inn, or the innkeeper. Good, she said. He worked on the wall for the morning, as he had been doing each day. He had nearly finished the section that had fallen inward, and had started on a different section that she had not yet noticed, was beginning to lean outward, which meant he had been looking at the wall on his own, and making assessments of what it needed, not waiting for her to direct him to the next task. She noticed this, and put it in the category of things that were different. After lunch, she took him to meet Mr. Finch. She had told Edmund about the wall dispute in detail on the second day of his visit, but telling and meeting were different things, and she had been waiting for the right moment, which she judged had arrived. She also had, in the previous week, written to the county archive about the 1887 boundary maps, and received a response with the relevant documents, which she had read carefully, and which confirmed what she had suspected, which was that the fence removal in question had been fully legal and properly recorded, and that the dispute was based on a misremembering of events that had been passed down through the Finch family as fact. She had not told Mr. Finch yet. She wanted Edmund there when she did. They walked down to the East Cottage in the afternoon. Captain was on the windowsill when they arrived, which was his usual position at this time of day, and he regarded Edmund with the thorough, unhurried assessment of a senior military officer reviewing a new arrival. Edmund stood still under the assessment, without making any gesture toward the cat, which Clara noted as the correct approach, and which she had not expected him to know. After approximately 4 seconds, Captain turned back to the window. He's accepted you provisionally, Clara said. That is more than I expected, Edmund said. Mr. Finch made tea. He was 81 and moved slowly around his kitchen, with the economy of someone who has learned to manage space carefully, and he brought the tea and the documentary evidence that Clara had brought from the archive, and they sat around the kitchen table with Captain on his windowsill, and Clara laid out the documents. She explained them clearly and completely. The boundary as it had been in 1880, the fence that was removed in 1887, and the documentation of its removal, which included the boundary agreement that showed the removal was in full accord with the agreed line, the specific record that contradicted what the Finch family had understood to be true about the removal. Mr. Finch looked at the documents for a long time. He was a man who had carried a family grievance for decades, and family grievances do not dissolve immediately, even when the documentation against them is clear. He turned the papers over in his hands. He looked at the boundary map. He looked at the record of the removal. He looked at Clara. My grandfather was very certain, he said. I know, she said. He may have been certain, and also wrong. It happens. Captain jumped down from the windowsill and went to stand at Mr. Finch's feet with the expectant air of a cat who has decided that the humans have talked enough, and it is time for something else. Edmund said, quietly, to Mr. Finch, I can have the estate solicitor prepare a formal document clarifying the boundary, if you would find that useful. Not to argue about what happened in 1887, but to establish what the boundary is now, so that there is no question going forward. Mr. Finch looked at him. You'd do that? It's the right thing to do, Edmund said. The uncertainty has been sitting here for a long time. A clear document removes it. Mr. Finch looked down at Captain, who was now sitting on his boot, with the proprietorial certainty of a cat who has decided this is now his foot. He looked at the documents again. I'll speak to Mrs. Burrows, he said finally. I think she'll be glad to hear it, Clara said. They walked back up the track in the afternoon light. Edmund was quiet for a while, then he said, he was carrying that for a long time. 40 years, approximately, she said. Possibly longer if his father told him the story before he was told it as a grown man. 40 years, he said. Over a fence. Over a story about a fence, she said. Over what his grandfather believed was an injustice. The fence is just the fence. The thing being carried was something else entirely. He walked for a moment in silence. "I have been carrying things without knowing what they were for a long time too," he said. She did not say anything. She let the statement be there. "Not the same thing," he said. "Different things, but the same mechanism. Taking the story I was given about a situation and holding on to it so long that it became fact." She looked at the fell ahead of them, at the track winding up toward the cottage. "The documents help," she said, "when you can find them. They tell you what actually happened, which is often different from what was passed down. And when you can't find the documents," he said, "then you sit with someone who knows," she said, "and you listen to them properly, which you have been doing." He looked at her sideways. "Is that what I have been doing?" "Yes," she said, "among other things." She heard him, briefly, let out a breath. Not quite a sigh, more like something put down. They were at the cottage gate. The afternoon was going to evening. The fell was going from the gold of mid-afternoon to the cooler, longer shadows of the end of the day. "Tomorrow morning," she said, 6:30. "I'll be here," he said. She was awake at 6. She built the fire, dressed, made tea, drank it standing at the kitchen window watching the garden in the gray of the early morning, the seedlings holding steady in their beds, the wall section Edmund had repaired solid in the corner. He was at the gate at exactly 6:30. He had the binoculars from the Fell Arms. She had her grandmother's pair. They walked up the track in the early light without speaking, because the early morning on the fell did not require speaking, and they both knew it now. The north face of Brant Ridge was lit from the east when they reached the position she had identified. The limestone glowed the pale gold of limestone in early morning light, which was different from the limestone in afternoon light, and from the limestone in gray weather. Different in the way that all the things she had been learning were different, depending on when and where, and with what attention you looked at them. She raised the binoculars. She found the ledge. The female was there, exactly where she had been on Wednesday, on the same ledge, in the same resting stillness. She reached over without lowering her binoculars and touched his arm. He raised his. She heard the small sound of him finding the correct angle, and then the stillness of him finding what he was looking at. They stood on the fell in the early morning, and they watched the peregrines on the north face of Brant Ridge, and they did not say anything. And the morning came in around them, and the limestone warmed in the increasing light. And after a while the female shifted and called once, a sharp, carrying sound, the voice of something that has no interest in being quiet about what it is. And from above and to the left the male came in, fast now, and landed beside her, and they both stood on the ledge and looked out at the fell morning. "There," she said. "There," he said. They walked back to the cottage. She made breakfast. He ate it at her table, which he had been doing for 3 weeks, and which felt, she noticed, entirely natural. Not comfortable in the managed way that things at Hartwell had been comfortable. Natural in the way of things that fit. "I want to say something," he said over his second cup of tea. She waited. "When I was 12 years old," he said, "my father took me to see the peregrines on the North Crags. It was early morning, earlier than I had ever been up voluntarily. He told me the night before that we were going to see something, and not to ask what. We walked up the north path from the lane. I did not know the fell well then. I was frightened by the height, and he brought me to the spot below the limestone face, and he put his field glasses in my hands, and he pointed up." He paused. She was on the ledge, the female, exactly where she was this morning, and I looked at her, and I felt something I did not have a name for, which was, I think now it was what you described about the fell making you the actual size of a person. I was 12, and I was frightened of the height, and I was very small in the fell, and the peregrine was on the limestone above me, and she did not care at all that I was there, and something about that, about her complete, total not caring, was the most reassuring thing I had ever seen. He looked at his cup. "My father died the following year," he said. "I have not told that story to anyone. I have not been back to the North Crags until this week. I told myself for 30 years that the reason was that I was busy, and that peregrines were not something I particularly thought about." He paused. "The real reason is that it was something specific to him and to me, and I did not want to put it in a context where it had to be explained or received by someone who did not know what it was." Clara looked at him, at this man who had been carrying a 12-year-old morning on a fell for 30 years, and had not known what to do with it. "That is a very good private thing," she said. "Yes," he said, "I think so." She looked at the window. The fell was fully lit now, the morning well established. "You should talk to Amos about his drawings," she said. "Not about commissioning one or displaying them. Just ask him about them. He showed you. He will talk about it if you ask the right way." "What is the right way?" "Ask what he sees when he looks at the trees," she said. "Not what the trees are, what he sees." He looked at her for a moment. "That is the kind of question I have not been asking people," he said. "No," she said, "but you could start." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something else," he said. "About what I want." She waited. "I have been thinking about what you said, about coming back as yourself, entirely, about the notebook, and the tenants, and the oak trees, and the attention." He set down his cup. "I want you to know that I do not want the other version. The managed version, the version I thought I was asking for when I proposed." He looked at her. "I understand, now, what I would have been asking for, which is someone to run the surface of things with great efficiency, while disappearing underneath it. I do not want that. I want the person who knows what's in the notebook, and knows the names of 23 families, and knows why the crack in the third pew has been there for 40 years, and who has opinions about limestone pavement, and peregrines, and dry stone walling." He paused. "I want to learn to see the things you see. Not perfectly, and not immediately, but genuinely, over time, in the way you have learned this fell." She looked at him. "That is a very large thing to want," she said. "I know," he said. "It will require you to be regularly wrong about things," she said, "and to say so, and not manage it into something else." "I know that too," he said. "I was wrong about a word, and I said so, and the sky did not fall." She held her cup. Outside the garden was in full morning light, everything clear and specific and real. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right?" "All right," she said. "We go back in a week. We go back as what we have become here, both of us. And we find out what that makes of Hartwell." She met his eyes. "And we keep the notebook open." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was not composure, and not its management, but the thing she had been watching grow in him for 3 weeks. The open, attending expression of someone who is actually present to what is in front of him. "Yes," he said, "we keep the notebook open." They finished breakfast. They went out to the garden. She showed him what still needed doing before she could leave it. The last bed to be turned. The runner bean frame she had been building that needed its final section secured. The general tidying of a garden that had been worked hard and needed an hour of settling attention. They worked. The morning passed. The fell was around them, and the sky was the sky, and they were the actual size of people, working in a garden they had both had a hand in making, and it was a specific, ordinary, real morning, and nothing about it was managed. She noted it in the notebook that evening. A specific, ordinary, real morning in the garden with another person. That is the actual thing. Not more than that, and not less. The last week before leaving was the fullest week she had spent on the fell. Not because she was trying to accumulate experiences against the leaving, though she felt something like that in the background. The particular attention of someone who knows they are leaving a place and wants to receive it fully before they go. It was full in the way that endings are full when they are real endings, which is to say, they were also beginnings, and beginnings have a specific quality of everything being more present than usual. She walked every day. She walked the familiar routes and the less familiar routes, and one morning she went back to the tarn alone, early, before he arrived at 9, and she sat at the water's edge for an hour, and let the fell do what it had been doing to her for 2 months, which was make her accurately sized, and give her back the room she had needed. She had needed more than she knew. She had come to the fell with one bag, and a notebook, and an understanding that she was going somewhere specific and necessary, but she had not known, when she came, exactly what she would find when she got there. She had found herself, not in the dramatic way of stories about people who find themselves, which tended to involve a single moment of revelation, but in the gradual, unglamorous way that was actually how it happened, which was day by day, fire by fire, bed by bed of turned soil, the slow accumulation of a person discovering what they were for. She was for paying attention. She had always known this, but had not fully understood its implications, which were larger than they appeared. Paying attention was not a passive skill, it was the most active thing she did. It required the constant, deliberate choice to see what was actually there, rather than what was expected, what was convenient, what fit the categories you had already established. It required keeping the categories loose enough to be revised by evidence, which was uncomfortable, and often inconvenient, and was, she had discovered, the only way to remain accurately connected to what was real. She was for physical reality. She had not known this before the fell. She had known she was capable of physical reality. She was a capable person in general, and had never doubted her ability to manage practical tasks. But she had not known that physical reality was a need for her, not a capability. The garden and the wall and the fires and the walks were not things she had done to fill time or to demonstrate competence. They were requirements, as much as air was a requirement. They connected her to the world in a way that made the world real, and she was someone who needed the world to be real. She sat at the tarn and thought about what she was taking back. She was taking the notebooks, all 4 of them now, and the natural history books from Hartwell's library, and the philosophical dry stone wall book she had bought from a second-hand shop in Brackenmore, and her grandmother's fell walking guides. She was taking the knowledge of the fell, which was in her body now, in her feet, and her legs, and her lungs, and her sense of the sky, the fell's own particular language that she had been learning since the first day. She was taking herself. That was the main thing. She was taking the self she had found here, and she was carrying it back into the life she had come from. And the test, not a test she was administering, just the test that reality administered naturally when you put 2 things next to each other, was whether the life could hold her as she was. She thought it could. She was not certain, because certainty was not available here, only the reasonable confidence of someone who has done the full work of assessing the situation honestly and arrived at a well-grounded conclusion. She was not the same person who had left Hartwell in March, and the life she was going back to was not the same life she had left. Edmund had been changed by what had happened, genuinely, in the specific ways she had been watching for and finding evidence of, and she thought the 2 changed things might fit together in a way the original 2 had not quite managed. And if they didn't, she would say so. At the breakfast table, to his face, directly. She had told him that was what she would do, and she meant it, and he had said he understood, and she believed that too. The agreement was not a guarantee. It was a structure, and structures gave you something to return to when things went wrong, which they would sometimes, because things always sometimes went wrong, and having a structure for that was not small. She got up from the tarn and walked back to the cottage in the morning light. She built the fire and made breakfast and was eating when she heard his footsteps on the track. He was carrying something. She saw it through the kitchen window as he came up the garden path, a flat, rectangular parcel wrapped in brown paper, awkward under his arm. She opened the door. "What is that?" she said. "Something from Amos," he said. He held it out to her. "He sent it up with the land agent's courier last week. I did not know whether to give it to you until this morning." She took it. She carried it inside and set it on the table and unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a drawing, pen and ink, very fine work, clearly done by someone with genuine skill that she had not known Amos had, which meant it was a thing she was discovering about him at a remove. It was a drawing of the elder, the oldest oak at the end of the south lawn, not the whole tree, which would have been impossible to draw without losing the character of it, but the trunk from the root flare to the first major branch, the bark rendered with extraordinary attention, every furrow and ridge and the irregular texture of old bark, which was as individual as a fingerprint if you looked at it long enough. In the bottom right corner, in small, precise letters, for Clara, who knew her. She looked at it for a long time. "He drew this," she said. "He has been drawing for 40 years, Edmund said. He showed me several others when I went to speak with him about the branch that came down in the spring storm. He draws the trees mostly. He did not want to show me them at first. He said they were private." A pause. "I told him about the notebook, not the contents, just that there was one, and that you kept it, and that it was about the place." Another pause. "He said he thought you should have the drawing." She looked at the drawing. At the elder's bark, rendered line by careful line, by a man who had spent 30 years looking at these trees. She thought about what it meant that Amos had 40 years of drawings he had not shown anyone, or had shown only rarely. Drawings of things he loved, and that were his, in the way the notebook was hers. She thought about all the interior lives that moved through a place, through Hartwell, through any place where people worked and lived, that were never visible on the surface. The notebook and Amos's drawings, and Mrs. Burroughs's kitchen garden, and Mr. Finch's long, complicated relationship with a boundary line that was really about his grandfather and his grief. All of it happening, constantly, beneath the managed surface of things. "Tell me something you keep privately," she said. "Something you have never told anyone." He looked at her. He was slightly surprised, which she noted. "The Peregrines," he said, after a moment. "But I told you that yesterday." "Tell me something else," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the drawing of the elder. "I have been drawing too," he said, very quietly. She looked at him. "Not well," he said. "Not like that." He gestured at the drawing. "I started when I was young, and I stopped when I understood I was not skilled enough to do it the way I wanted to do it. I have not drawn anything in 20 years. He paused. "I sat in my room at the Fell Arms on the third evening, and I found I had a pencil in my coat, and there was a piece of the inn's notepaper on the desk, and I drew the view from the window, which was the lower section of the track and the wall, and the limestone of the fell above." He stopped. It was not good, but I kept it. She held the drawing of the elder. "Show me," she said. He reached into his jacket. He had it with him. He held it out to her. A single sheet of the Fell Arms notepaper, folded, with a pencil drawing on it, that was careful, and not technically skilled, and entirely real. The lower section of the track. The dry stone wall running alongside it. The limestone of the fell above the wall. The texture of it, rendered with the attention of someone who has been looking at it every day for 2 weeks. She looked at it for a long time. "You kept it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not certain why. I think because it was the first time in 20 years that I made something and did not immediately assess whether it was good enough." She handed it back to him. "Keep it," she said. "Draw more. It doesn't have to be good enough." He looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. She spent the last week closing the cottage in the way that things should be closed, with care and attention, and without hurry. She settled the garden, which she had brought to a state where it would be fine for several months without her, the beds mulched, the bean frame complete, the water situation managed. She settled her accounts with Margaret Fell and George Abbott and Archie Dean, not money accounts, which were already settled, but the accounts of genuine thanks, the kind you paid in person, with the specific currency of saying exactly what someone had given you. She told Margaret Fell that she had given her the word resident, and that it had meant more than Margaret perhaps understood, because it was the first word after her name that had been simply true rather than complicated, and that she had needed to be somewhere where words were simply true. She told George Abbott that he had graded the track because it was bothering him, and that being bothered by things that needed fixing and then fixing them was a quality she admired more than she had previously known words to say. She told Archie Dean that saving the good bread for her every morning was a thing she was going to remember specifically and in detail, and that she intended to come back and buy it again. All three of them received this in the Brackenmore way, which was without fuss and with the slight forward nod of people who have heard the important thing and are acknowledging that they have heard it, without making a performance of the hearing. She wrote thank you letters to all three of them as well, because she was someone who believed that saying a thing in person and then writing it down were not the same act, but were both necessary in their own right. On the last Thursday, Edmund helped George with a final section of the track grading. He did not need to. The section in question was George's problem and George's equipment, but he showed up on the morning with his boots and his willingness, and George, who had formed an opinion of him at the village hall that Clara knew about from Walter, accepted the help without comment, which was its own kind of acceptance. She watched from the garden as they worked. She did not go down. This was not her lesson to be part of. When Edmund came back up the track afterward, he had mud on his boots, and the expression she had learned to recognize as the expression he wore when he had done something with his body that required him to stop thinking, which he found useful. "George says hello," he said. He does not say hello, she said. He nods. Edmund looked at her. He nodded, he said. At the bottom of the track, very deliberately. That is hello, she said. From George. Edmund smiled. Not the almost smile this time. A real one, with the warmth of something entirely unguarded in it. She looked at it and thought, I have been watching for that since the first day he came through the gate. She did not say this. She went back to the garden. They closed the cottage on Friday evening. She walked through all the rooms and looked at them in the last light, noting what they were and what they had been and what they had given her. The main room with the fireplace and her grandmother's books, and the table where she had written 4 notebooks and read her way through everything she had needed to read. The kitchen, with the window she had stood at on her first morning, looking at the garden. The stairs, with the 7th step that creaked, which she had noted in the 2nd week, and had thought, I need to remember which step this is, so that I know where I am in the dark. She came back downstairs and stood at the front door, and looked at the garden in the evening light. The beds were in order. The wall was repaired. The corner was cleared. The rusted fork stood in its place near the back wall. She had decided from the moment she left it standing that it would stay. It was part of the garden's history. It was part of hers. She closed the door. She locked it. She put the key back under the 3rd flat stone from the left. She stood in the garden for a moment in the evening quiet of the fell. Around her the limestone fells were going from gold to the cooler colors of evening, and the sky above was the specific blue of high altitude at dusk, and the curlew was calling somewhere on the upper slope with its usual question, in its usual language, and she stood in the middle of all of it, and simply, for a moment, was there. In the morning Edmund was at the gate at 8, which was earlier than usual. I wanted to help with anything remaining, he said. There was nothing remaining. She had done everything the previous evening, but she led him into the garden, and they walked through it together, and she showed him what she had planted, and what it would do by summer, and he listened, and asked questions, and she answered them, and it was an ordinary conversation between 2 people, who are both paying attention to the same thing, and it was exactly that, and nothing more, and nothing less. They loaded her bag into the car. She had 1 bag, still, exactly as she had arrived, and he drove and she navigated, which was the practical arrangement that suited them, and they headed south through the fell country, and then out of it into the wider landscape of northern England, and she sat in the passenger seat with the fell still in her body and her feet and her lungs, and she watched the landscape change as they went south, and she let it change, and she did not try to hold on to what was behind her. The burrito was cold. She would go back. She knew this clearly. The cottage was hers, and the fell was hers in the way you own what you have paid full attention to, and she would go back, and she would take Edmund back with her, and they would find the Peregrines again, on the north face of Brant Ridge in the early morning, and she would show him the tarn and the different weathers she had learned and not yet shared, and he would stand on the limestone pavement and look into the grikes at the ancient ferns in their ancient microclimate, and the fell would make him the actual size of a person every time, because that was what fells did, and it was something he needed. They reached Hartwell as the light was going. The drive swept them up to the house, and the house was there, lit in the windows, Mrs. Dowell having set the lights as she always set them when the house was expecting arrivals. The south lawn was in the last light, and at the far end the elder stood, enormous and patient and simply herself, as she had been for 260 years. Clara got out of the car and stood in the drive and looked at the elder. 260 years. She had watched the house go up, and she had watched it change, and she had watched everyone who had ever lived in it come and go, and she had not moved, and she had not needed to, and she had been a landmark before any of this existed, and she would be a landmark after it. And in the meantime she stood at the end of the south lawn and held what she held and said nothing about it. Edmund came to stand beside her. "The same," she said. "She is exactly the same." "Yes," he said, "she is." They stood for a moment in the evening looking at the tree. Then Clara picked up her bag and walked to the front door, and Edmund held it open for her, and she went in. The house was the same. The hall table with the flower arrangement, winter hellebores, which Mrs. Dowell had put there, dark purple and cream in the tall blue vase. The clock in the parlor marking the half-hour. The particular smell of Hartwell, which was old stone and wood fires and books, and the faint herbal undertone of Mrs. Pritchard's kitchen, which was a smell she had not known was specifically Hartwell until she had been away from it for 2 months. She walked through to the second drawing room and opened the door. Captain was on the windowsill. He turned his head and looked at her with the one-eared, imperious authority of a creature who has been holding the position in her absence and is not certain yet whether to be pleased or affronted by the disruption of her return. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. He held her gaze for approximately 4 seconds, which she had learned was the amount of time he required to complete an assessment. Then he turned back to the window. She took this as acceptance. She went upstairs and put her bag on the bed in the room that was her room, and stood for a moment looking at the dressing table, the small dish where she put the hairpins, the mirror, the drawer where the notebook had been. She took the newest notebook from her bag and set it in the drawer. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it back out and set it on top of the dressing table, in the open, where it was visible. She went back downstairs. Edmund was in the entrance hall looking at the hellebores. "They're good," he said. "The arrangement." "Yes," she said. "Mrs. Dowell always gets it right. I should tell her so," he said. "You should," she said, specifically. "Not the arrangements have been good this winter. Something specific about these. The way the purple and the cream work together in this light," he said. "The proportion of the vase to the stems." She looked at him. He was looking at the flowers with the attention she had been describing to him for weeks, the actual attention. "Yes," she said, "like that." She went to the kitchen to say hello to Mrs. Pritchard, who received her return with a restrained warmth that was its own kind of eloquence, and who had apparently been preparing for the arrival with a meal that smelled as though it had been given the same quality of attention that Mrs. Pritchard gave to everything she considered important. She went to find Mrs. Dowell, who was in the linen cupboard at the end of the upper corridor, the same one Clara had reorganized at 11 o'clock on the night of the spring dinner party, the night Edmund had told her she didn't make things about herself, the reorganization that had taken 45 minutes and made no practical difference, and which she had needed to do with a precision she now understood better than she had then. The towels were in the correct order. She had left them correctly organized, and they had stayed correctly organized, because Mrs. Dowell had known how they were organized and had maintained it. Someone had been paying attention while she was gone. She went to the notebook on the dressing table that evening, and she wrote, "I am back. The house is the same, and I am not, and the combination of those two things is the most interesting thing I have encountered in a very long time, and I intend to pay full attention to it." She wrote, "The elder is exactly herself. Mrs. Dowell's hellebores are in the blue vase. Captain accepted my return after a 4-second assessment, which I am choosing to interpret positively. Edmund told Mrs. Dowell specifically what he noticed about the flower arrangement. That is not the same as what we had before. I am noting it." She wrote, "I do not know what comes next. I know that I will keep looking, and I know that he will keep trying to look, and I know that looking together is different from looking alone, though I would not trade the alone looking for anything, because that was what made the rest possible." She wrote, "The notebook is on the dressing table, where it can be seen. That is new." She closed it. She went to the window. The south lawn was fully dark, and the elder was a shape against the darker sky, enormous and patient, and entirely herself. She thought about Amos and his 40 years of drawings. She thought about the peregrines on the north face of Brant Ridge and the morning Edmund's father had taken him to see them, and the 12-year-old boy who had held the binoculars with his hands cold from the early morning, and the feeling of the world being larger than he had understood it to be. She thought about the crack in the third pew at St. Giles, filled by someone who cared enough to fix it, but not enough to match the color, which was a specific kind of person, and she had been thinking about that person on and off since her own wedding day, and she thought she might go back and look at the crack again in daylight, with better light, and see what else she could read in it. She thought about the gate that Amos had found in the roots of the second oak, the iron hinge, deeply buried, the record of a boundary that had existed and had been removed and had left its trace in the earth for 100 years, for someone to find if they were paying attention and digging in the right place. Things left traces. That was the thing the notebook had taught her, and the fell, and the limestone pavement with its carboniferous record of a tropical sea. Everything that had ever happened left a trace, and the traces were there for the person who looked for them, and looking for them was the most interesting thing you could do with a life. She was going to keep looking. She turned from the window. The room was warm. The notebook was on the dressing table in the open. She heard, somewhere in the house, the sound of Edmund coming up the stairs. Not the composed sound of a man moving through his own house with absolute certainty of everything in it. The slightly different sound of a man paying attention to where he was. Third step on the back staircase. He stepped over it. She heard him step over it clearly, and she stood in the room and felt something move through her that she was getting better at recognizing, which was the specific warmth of being known. Not completely. She had no illusions about completely. But in this specific way, about this specific step, in this specific moment. It was enough to begin with. It was, she thought, more than enough. She picked up the notebook from the dressing table and opened it to the next page, and she wrote the last thing for that evening, which was, the third step on the back staircase. He remembered. I am noting it. She set down the pen. She closed the notebook. She left it on the dressing table, closed but visible, where anyone paying the right kind of attention would see it. Then she went to see about supper. The house was warm around her. The elder stood at the end of the south lawn in the full dark, 260 years of patience holding steady in the November night, as she had always held, as she would continue to hold, watching and being watched by no one in particular, and everyone who bothered to look. She had always been there. The thing was simply to look,